Welcome, my friends, to our 2025 gaming PC tutorial sponsored by our friends here at Micro Center. This video is a one-stop shop to teach you everything you need to know, whether this is your first or 10th PC build. We're going to go through choosing components, how to put everything together, how to do all your cable management, as well as how to install your drivers, your windows, all the stuff you need to go from a cart full of parts to a fully completed PC. And this year we're doing things a little bit differently. We're going to be showing you how to build a very high-end gaming PC with a lot of the latest tech, a lot of the latest fans, GPUs, you name it. So even if you've built PCs in the past, there's still a lot of stuff that hopefully you'll find useful here. So let's get started by choosing our components. Let's start out by talking about our graphics card. Now normally when I do these tutorials, I talk about the CPU first because that will help you choose the motherboard and all this kind of stuff. But this year, I actually want to focus on the GPU first. Not only because this is probably going to be the single most expensive part of your entire build, but on top of that, it also dictates a lot of the decisions that you're going to be making with the rest of your components. The GPU is probably the single most important component for a PC when it comes to gaming. Like how the CPU processes general data. The GPU processes, well, graphics data. Usually, everything else being equal. The more powerful a GPU is, the more FPS and resolution you can push in games. Now you can go really in depth with graphics cards, but the two most important specs are processing power and memory. This is a huge oversimplification, but for NVIDIA, for example, more CUDA cores and higher clock speeds typically are better, but there's some nuance there, right? Like what generation it is. Like there's no general recommendation for spec that you need to hit with a GPU. That will definitely come down to the games you want to play, what resolution, refresh rate your monitor can handle, and of course, most importantly, the budget you've got to work with. GPUs also have their own memory, which is separate from your system's RAM. This is called VRAM, and that too is very highly specialized for graphics. Again, this is a lot of oversimplification, but generally speaking, more VRAM and more bandwidth is always better. It's a little easier to make a recommendation when it comes to this. You're really going to want at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM to play modern games, but I'd recommend 10 to 12 gigs of VRAM or even higher if you can swing it, as that's going to not only help with performance, but especially when it comes to future-proofing, if you want to play at higher resolutions, you're really going to want that. So you have 3 brands to choose from. First of all is Intel. Their Arc GPUs are terrific, especially on a budget. AMD, which has a very wide selection of stuff, especially in the mid-range, which is a really strong contender. Or you have NVIDIA. Now, NVIDIA is probably one of the most popular GPU manufacturers out there, and specifically with their brand new RTX 50 series, these are going to be the most high-performance options in the market. So that is why I'm going to be going with an RTX 5080. Now, this is about as high-end as it gets. So the RTX 50 series cards have just come out, and there's an enormous amount of performance here. And also an enormous amount of cost. But because we're doing the advanced gaming PC, we're going to show you how to build something which is really going to crush pretty much anything you could possibly throw at it. Next up, we're going to be choosing our CPU. Now you have 2 main choices here, AMD as well as Intel. The CPU, aka the processor, is often referred to as the brain of the computer. Its job is to process data and execute programs. Now it's a key component for a few reasons. Not only because the responsiveness of your system is heavily tied to the processor, but the choice of CPU is a great place to start because it really does narrow down many of your other components. We'll get into this a little bit more in the motherboard section, but you always have to have a compatible motherboard with the CPU that you've chosen. Now for this build, I'm going to focus on AMD, specifically because there's a couple of options in this case that I think are a little bit more suited for my build. But let me actually walk you through what you're getting here, because there are, as you can probably see, a lot of different choices. Understanding the AMD Ryzen CPU lineup is a little bit complicated. So the first number you'll see, either 5, 7, or 9, denotes where it sits in the range. So generally speaking, a Ryzen 9 processor is the highest end, although as I'll say in a second, not always. And the next number you'll look at is the generation. So the most recent AMD Ryzen processors are 9000 series. However, there's also 7000 series, and if you want to go a little bit more on the budget side, the 5000 series. This is a more affordable way to go. However, generally speaking in 2025, especially on the high end, you're going to want to go with something like either Ryzen 7000 or specifically for this build, I want to go with Ryzen 9000, which is the most up-to-date version of AMD CPUs. This is one of their X3D processors, which has a bunch of additional cache on the chip, which is pretty much exclusively meant to speed up your games. So this is going to be an expensive choice. So you certainly could save some money by going with the standard Ryzen 7 9700X or even something like one of the 7000 series. But because we're going for the advanced high-end system, this is quite literally the best gaming CPU I could buy right now. Because my system is extremely gaming focused, my 9800X3D and 5080 is a really strong combo. But the nice thing about shopping at Micro Center is they have excellent combo deals across both Intel as well as AMD. So oftentimes when you're shopping here, you can choose a CPU, motherboard, and RAM all together, which not only simplifies the process of making sure that everything is compatible, but also you're pretty much always saving a pretty good chunk of money by letting them do the bundle for you. Next up, let's choose our motherboard. Now, because we've chosen an AMD CPU, that greatly simplifies which choice we actually want to go with.
Motherboards are important because every component of your build connects to the motherboard, and it determines some features that you're going to have or maybe not, such as built-in Wi-Fi. Make sure to pick out a motherboard with the socket that matches your CPU. This is absolutely mandatory because unlike a lot of PC components, which are pretty broadly applicable for almost any build, the motherboards are not created equally. AMD sockets right now are either the older but incredibly well-supported AM4 or the newest socket, which is AM5. Intel, on the other hand, is a little bit more complicated, with sockets such as LGA 1200 or 1700, with the latest socket being LGA 1851. The best way to tell is to check the box of your motherboard to see what generation of CPU it supports. But of course, checking the manufacturer's site for full compatibility is always a safe bet, especially because some AMD motherboards might physically support it, but it might need a BIOS update, and that's always a pain. Size also matters here. Motherboard sizes typically range from full standard ATX, going smaller to micro ATX, and finally mini ATX. But there are also niche sizes, like the Big Chungus eATX or the incredibly small Pico ITX. Now we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail when we get to cases, but keep in mind that while smaller motherboards will fit in a wider selection of cases, they typically have some drawbacks, including less expansion options, features, and sometimes, especially for ITX boards, they're just more expensive since they're just smaller and they can't fit as many connectors and there's more stuff that has to be crammed in there. Unless you're specifically building a small PC, normally micro ATX or standard ATX is the best move.
So for this build, we're going with the MSI Tomahawk X670E. Now this is simple because it is included with a bundle with our 9800X3D, but there are a few things you always want to pay attention to when you're purchasing a motherboard. First and foremost is that compatibility. With this sticker on the front, it says AMD Ryzen 9000 ready. That means that this should just work right out of the box. If you look around on the back side, there's a lot of stuff to consider here. So for example, it has a 2.5 gigahertz LAN port, so you have high-speed networking. You also do have Wi-Fi built in, and on top of that, you also do have, as this is an X670E board, support for PCI 5.0. Next up, we're going to be choosing RAM or random access memories. Not only the best Daft Punk album, but importantly something you'll really need for your PC.
Memory, commonly known as RAM, is kind of what it sounds like. It determines how much data your PC can hold in its short-term memory. This is very important for multitasking and active programs like web browsers, video editing, graphics design, gaming. I mean, you need RAM to do anything on a computer. Now in the past, even though DDR5 was a lot faster, it was also much more expensive. In past years, it was a common recommendation for a budget build to go with the still very reasonable DDR4 standard. But there's good news because DDR5 prices have come down quite a lot recently. So while you still can build a system with DDR4, and it is a little bit cheaper, it's a lot less future-proof at this point because very few new chips are actually coming out with any support for it. Which type of RAM you use is dictated by the motherboard, and the majority of current generation platforms will just straight up require DDR5 at this point. Now once you've got the DDR4 versus DDR5 thing sorted out, the biggest things to consider with RAM is the speed, which is how fast it works, and the capacity, how much you have to work with. If you're primarily concerned with everyday tasks like having tons of web browser tabs open or lots of multitasking, then having more capacity is much more important. 16 gigabytes should be the absolute minimum, and 32 gigs is really what you want for safety. If, on the other hand, you have much more intense workloads like video editing, gaming, or 3D rendering, you may want to put a little bit of extra budget to not only get a lot of RAM, but also to get faster RAM.
So for this build, because I'm utilizing the bundle, it makes it really straightforward. So by default, it comes with this G.Skill Flare X5 memory, although for an additional $10, you can upgrade to the Corsair equivalent. So the actual spec of these RAM is the exact same. The only difference is this has RGB. Because I'm a really good boy, I would like my really good bling. No matter what kind of PC you're building, you always need storage, and there are two main options here.
If RAM is short-term memory, then storage such as SSDs and hard drives are much more like long-term memory. They hold all of your data, such as computer programs, photos, videos, etc., ready to be accessed whenever you need it. Now, here's a little bit of a history lesson for you. Hard drives are some of the oldest sort of storage devices that have been used ever since the 50s and 60s. They just have a bunch of spinning plates inside, like really advanced CDs or something. And while they're not very fast, they are often used as cheap bulk storage. Moving on to SSDs, this is a completely different type of technology which uses flash memory. Everyone who's building a PC in 2025 should use a system with an SSD as the main drive. Now, when it comes to SSDs, there are two main types. SATA, which are older school and using the same kind of connector as a hard drive, and these are really helpful if you're maybe upgrading an older system. But if you're building a modern system, I recommend using an M2 NVMe SSD. These use the same flash memory as a regular SSD, but they get rid of that old SATA connection that limited the speeds. Top of the line NVMe SSDs are about 60 times faster than hard drives. Yep, you heard me right, 60 times faster. As long as your motherboard has an M2 slot, which if you're building a new system, it absolutely will, I recommend an NVMe SSD. Even a slow, relatively budget NVMe drive is still going to be way faster than any hard drive or regular SSD. Now, as for capacity, you can get by with as little as 500 gigabytes, but honestly, at least a terabyte is the safer bet. If you need more storage, you can pair your SSD boot drive with a secondary slower hard drive for stuff like files you don't need super fast access to, or old home movies that you look at every 3 years. But when it comes to apps, games, your operating system, all of that should always be run on your main SSD. For this build, we've opted for the Samsung 990 EVO Plus. Now, I've used a lot of Samsung SSDs over the years. They're really quite solid, and importantly, not only is this going to give us 2 terabytes of capacity for a reasonable price, but it's also going to be very, very fast.
Now, strictly speaking, something like this WD Blue 2 terabyte hard drive isn't necessary. A hard drive, the real advantage here is that you're getting a lot of somewhat cheap, slow-ish storage. Now, for something like a 2 terabyte hard drive, I'm mostly doing this just for the purposes of the tutorial. But if you want a lot of storage, you can go all the way up to something like a 22 terabyte hard drive, which will give you tons and tons of space that will fit in your system. But it's really more so about like what you want to do with it. If you're just loading up some games and whatnot, not necessary. But I would say a lot of people have a lot of stuff to store, and there's no point in having 2 or 3 SSDs if it's just full of photos of grandma. If you have 20 terabytes of photos of grandma, that's a sorry. So the power supply is a very critical part of any gaming PC, especially these days when you have something like an RTX 5080 in your system. It requires a ton of power.
This is the closest thing your PC has to a heart. It is a component that takes the AC power from the wall socket and converts it into stable DC power that the PC can use. It then distributes that power through cables like veins all throughout the PC. Power supplies measure output via watts. It's fairly straightforward. You just add up all of the power requirements for your PC components and then choose a power supply that exceeds that number. Usually your CPU and especially the GPU will have a minimum recommended wattage, which is a good place to start. And again, Micro Center has an excellent online PC builder that will help you calculate how much power your power supply might actually need to support. Just as a general guideline, a lower to mid-tier PC might be in the 500 to 700 watt range, an upper tier system might need 800 watts or more, and a high-end system might need over 1,000 watts. When in doubt, get more power, as power supplies can easily last you for years and even multiple PC builds. But especially after 4, 5, 6 years, they might lose a little bit of performance, so it's better to be safe than sorry. Now, you may also run into ratings such as 80 plus bronze or 80 plus gold. Those just mean how efficient the power supply is at converting your wall AC power into DC power for the PC to use. Now, a higher rating doesn't necessarily mean it's higher quality, but it can be a useful indicator. You do not want to skimp on a power supply. The worst case scenario is a bad power supply can straight up kill your PC, or at least do a lot of damage to components.
Not too long ago, I would have opted for something like this, a 750 watt power supply. However, because these RTX 50 series cards need a lot of power, I'm actually gonna go with something like this, which is a 1,000 watt supply. Because we're opting for the RTX 50 series card, you're really gonna wanna look for this. So this is a 16 pin connector. Now you can use adapters, so pretty much all graphics cards that need them will come with the adapters, and I'll show you that once we actually do the build. But I'll be honest with you, it is a lot nicer to have the power supply supporting it right out of the box. And you can see here, it shows not only ATX 3.1, but also PCIe 5.1. Again, I'm gonna explain all this stuff in a little bit, but this power supply should be more than enough for the build as is. So the nice things about shopping in store is that you can actually physically see the cases that you're purchasing. There's tons and tons of options, and I'm not gonna tell you what's right or wrong, but there are some things you should consider as far as size, compatibility, and whatnot.
The case is thankfully the most straightforward to explain. That big metal, sometimes glass, plastic, wood, or maybe even cardboard, but you didn't hear that from me. This is the enclosure that is going to hold all of your components. I would really recommend when you're looking for cases, this is where you should let your personality shine. What do you want your PC to look like? Do you want tons of RGB fans on the front? Do you want something that's a little bit more minimalistic? This is where you have the ability to completely customize your PC to exactly the way you want. But don't forget that the case should do basic case things. Stuff like good airflow, spots for fans, decent front I/O, lots of room to build on PC in. These are all things you should consider as you choose the case. Now, like I mentioned with the motherboards, there are different sizes of cases. So the standard size ATX cases are what I would say is a traditional PC tower. There are also smaller micro ATX and mini ATX cases if you really want a smaller footprint, but just remember that it might make building in a little bit trickier. On the other end of the extreme, you have eATX size cases, which are massive chunkuses that are specifically designed to house and show off your big bulky components like graphics cards. They're about as big as the size of my head, or maybe if you want to do something more intricate like a custom water cooling loop. For first-time builders, I recommend the standard ATX case, as it will probably provide enough airflow and it will give you enough space to build in comfortably.
I normally wouldn't do this, but because this is the more advanced video, we're gonna go for something a little bit out of the ordinary, which is this, the Lian Li O11 Vision. Now, this is a quite unique case. First and foremost, because there's a lot of glass. So not only do you have it on both sides, but it's even glass on the top. Now, for aesthetics, this is great. But what it does mean is that you have to not only supply your own fans, which is going to be something I'll show you how to do, but also there's some configuration as far as where you actually mount the motherboard and how we're actually going to make sure that, like, for example, we actually probably want intake on the back. But I do think by the time we're done, this thing is gonna look absolutely sick. This is an advanced tutorial. For advanced, expert level people who maybe are still building their first PC, but I'm trying to show you how to do the entire range in one single video. If that's not worth subscribing for, I don't know what is. Except maybe me trying to fit inside this box. I do think I can fit in that box. I'm pretty sure I can do it. Depending on your build, you may not actually have to purchase any additional fans because a lot of cases will come with them pre-populated, but let me explain to you how you do it. And also I need fans because my case has 0 inside to start with. There are a bunch of different types of fans. The most important thing to look at is the size. So for example, you can see that there are these little 80mm guys, there's 92mm, but the most common is 120. Now there are larger fans, including a 140 or even a 200mm. The size of fan, like a lot of things, is going to be dictated by the size of your case. So on the actual case box, it will have a little bit of a disclaimer like, oh, you can fit 2 120s or 140 or whatever the case is. But I know for our case, we're gonna be looking for 5 fan. 5 fan. So I'm actually gonna show you 2 different ways of doing this. So I'm actually gonna grab, let's see here, we wanna go with white. I'm gonna go with this. So this is a RX 120, it's gonna be an RGB fan. I'm actually gonna grab 2 of these, but I'm also gonna go with something a little bit higher end to show you how that goes. So you can see that Lian Li has a huge amount of these fans, which are called unifans. But the main advantage of unifans is that they actually sort of attach to each other. I'll explain this a lot more when we're actually building it, but essentially, if you want super clean cable runs and you've got a little bit of budget to spend, going with something like this is nice. This is, I think, the highest end build we've ever done for PC tutorial. You don't have to go all out on a lot of this stuff, right? But I'm gonna show you how to install it if you did want to go with something like unifans. If you did want to go with something like a 360mm radiator, or a 5080, or whatever the case is. But if you're building a 5600X system with a 3060 inside for 1/3 the price I'm spending, all of this stuff should be applicable. With all this power, you gotta keep it cool, which is where our next category comes in, the CPU cooler.
The CPU cooler does exactly what it sounds like. It cools the CPU. Now that little piece of silicon performs billions of calculations per second, so it can get pretty toasty. Luckily, a lot of low and mid-range CPUs you buy will come with a stock cooler. Honestly, even though it's not the fanciest thing in the world, it's totally fine. And you don't really need anything more if you're building a low to mid-range PC. High-end processors, on the other hand, won't ship with stock coolers, since you will definitely need to purchase a fairly powerful cooler to keep them under control. Generally, CPU coolers fall into one of 2 categories, liquid or air cooling. Now there isn't a big difference in performance between most off-the-shelf liquid and air coolers, as there are plenty of wimpy, tiny air coolers that are meh, along with massive ones. Just the same way that there are tiny, sort of questionable 120mm liquid coolers, and there are also huge 360mm or bigger options, right? There are definitely pros and cons to each way you go. Liquid cooling draws the heat away from the CPU via a heatsink, and liquid carries that heat away to be dissipated through a radiator to blow it all out your case. Now this method is typically quieter than air cooling, and the higher end coolers will have cool little additional features such as a screen that can have like a GIF loop or some specs, but they can be a little bit difficult to install depending on the configuration of your case. Not to mention there is a, albeit small, risk of liquid leaking from the cooler and damaging other components. Air cooling is the tried and true cooling method. It's just a fan blowing air through a heatsink that draws that heat away from the CPU. It is simple, which means that it's much less likely to break. But high performance air coolers can take up a lot of space. If your PC case doesn't have a lot of clearance, it actually can be difficult to fit a big air cooler into your system. They also can sometimes get a little bit on the loud side, especially when the PC is working on a heavy load such as gaming. Now, ultimately, this choice is up to you. I personally tend to lean a little bit more towards solid air coolers, but a lot of gamers, especially on the high end, tend to take advantage of liquid cooling.
This is an area where you're going to want to consider a couple of things. So first of all, the performance, so something like a 240 versus a 360. Our case has a perfect slot for a 360. It would kind of look weird if I went with something smaller. But on top of that, there are other things you may want to consider, not only with the aesthetic. So I'm gonna go with this because it is a nice sort of matching white aesthetic, but it also does have RGB fans, which will look nice. Because I've gone so overkill with so many things on the system, I'm gonna try to be practical when it comes to my CPU cooler for this build. With that, my friends, I think it's time to head back to the studio and build our gaming PC. I'm gonna learn how to count to 7. Alrighty, my friends, it is time to begin the PC tutorial in earnest, he says 20 minutes into his YouTube video. Before we actually put all our parts together, the only really thing you need to prep is an actual surface. So I have a nice sized desk here. Normally, if this is your first build, it's usually gonna take you maybe like an afternoon, like 3 or 4 hours. Obviously go a little bit faster. But maybe just set up in an area that if you need to leave it overnight, you could, just in case, maybe, I don't know, something doesn't work or whatever. Basically what I'm saying is don't build this on your dining room table when you have to have dinner in 2 hours and your mom's gonna get mad. As far as tools go, very simple. All you're gonna need is a screwdriver, so a Phillips screwdriver should be fine, and then really just like a knife to open the boxes. You'll wanna be a little bit careful of a thing called static electricity. Now there's a lot of like wristbands and goofiness. I don't really do that. You can if you want. Mostly just maybe don't build on carpet with socks and going like. To begin with, let's go ahead and clear a bunch of our stuff out of the way, and we're gonna take this one step at a time, starting with our motherboard. Again, almost every part of your PC is going to connect to the motherboard in one way or another. Now, one of the nice things about it is that you can actually use the box as a little building station. So normally what I'll do is I'll open up the motherboard and just put it right on the box as I'm putting everything together. Because before we even put anything in the case, we're gonna put a few components into the motherboard before we actually continue from there. Now, underneath this box, you will see a few extra accessories, including some stickers. I'll get some lucky stickers. Well, that's cute. Some of the things you actually want to look for in here, if your motherboard has Wi-Fi, usually you'll have your antennas here. Definitely don't lose these. We also have a couple of SATA cables, which we will be using a little bit later, and a bunch of little screws, which we will just carefully put off to the side. Now, as you work through the PC build, something to keep in mind, try to stay a little bit organized, right? Like it's fine to use like your case box to like throw a bunch of junk in, but there's a lot of little bits and bobs that you don't really want to lose. And as you put stuff like screws and whatnot, just try to find a little area to put them, right? So for example, I'm going to put all of this stuff right off to the side because I'm going to build on the box. Let's also talk about the instruction manual, which is what I'm trying to do in real life right here. This is something you'll probably want to hold on to. So every motherboard will give you some kind of installation guide. Again, I'm going to walk you through all of this, but it is sometimes helpful, especially for some of like the smaller like wiring things. Sometimes I'll have like a diagram on here. Other than that, we're going to go ahead and close up the box. And now let's pull our motherboard out. You can see here it's in this sort of like anti-static bag. So I like to put this on the box because it's a nice little area for me to work on things. Let me give you a little tour of what your motherboard is all about. Even though there's a lot to look at, it's actually not too intimidating. Let's start it in the middle. So this is our CPU socket. So as the name implies, this is where we're going to be installing our CPU. To the right of that is where our memory goes, our RAM. So we have 4 DIMMs here. That's very much the common standard. There are some boards, certainly some smaller boards that may only have 2, and some really, really high-end boards that may actually have 8, but like 95% of boards you're gonna have are gonna have 4. To the right of that is our 20+4 4-pin. This is the main power for the motherboard. So this is going to come from our power supply. So when we go to plug that in, this is pretty much always on the right side of the motherboard. While we're on the top right of the motherboard, let me point out our fan connectors. So this is a pretty high-end board. So we have 5 just in the top right corner. We're going to use these for a few different things. So not only for our CPU fan, but also for case fans. If you're using a liquid cooler, there's a specific header that is meant for your pump. I'll explain that a little bit, but basically these are very simple. Again, like most things when it comes to a PC, you can only plug it in one way. So there's a little notch on the bottom of all of these. So you could plug in either a 3 or a 4-pin fan to these. So it's very straightforward there. On the top left of the board, you're going to find your CPU power connectors. In this case, we have 2. So there's one 8-pin here as well as one 8-pin here. Depending on the motherboard, a lot of lower end motherboards actually only have a single 8-pin. If I'm honest with you, that's kind of fine for the vast majority of CPUs. But especially on the Intel side, there are some CPUs that take some serious power, which is why they include 2. These, much like most of the connectors on your motherboard, are keyed so they will only go in one way. Actually, you know, I'll just say just very broadly. The vast majority of things that you do on the motherboard when you're building the PC are very much designed with, I don't want to say to be idiot-proof, but they're definitely designed with a little bit of margin. So, good general rule of thumb. If you go to plug something in and it's really fighting you, make sure that's not supposed to be flipped the other direction. I will be very clear any of these things that are a little bit more challenging, but there's a little key on the outside of this one, there's a little key on the outside of this one. Coming around to the left side of the motherboard, this again is a little bit more of a high-end board, so it actually already has our I/O shield already installed. Now this is becoming a lot more common, but some motherboards may actually have a separate I/O shield, which you would have to put in once you put it into the case. So we'll show a clip of that right now, but essentially if you've got a higher-end board like this, it's already installed, so you don't have to worry about it. Most cases have done away with that, or at least most motherboards have done away with that. Moving down to the middle of the motherboard, this is where we would install our SSD. Now for this, I'm actually going to pull my screwdriver out because it's a little bit hidden. If you're using an M2 SSD, which the odds are, if you're building a modern system you are, there are actually going to be a number of M2 slots on most motherboards. But generally speaking, you're going to want to use the highest one. So if you have any questions about this, you can check with the manual. It will typically tell you the highest slots are usually the ones that are like the fastest, but it doesn't make a huge difference. But we go ahead and undo these two. This is a little heatsink that sort of not only hides your SSD, but also keeps it cool. So we get our screwdriver out. What we can do is take off this little heatsink, which is on the very top, and it will reveal our M2 SSD slot. Now for a board like this, in fact, most motherboards, you're gonna have at least 2 or 3 of these. So you can see that we have another one here, and I believe, if I pop this one off, we can install another SSD or 2 right here. So yeah, so underneath this, we have 2 more. So this motherboard has a total of 1, 2, 3, 4 M2 slots. Things to consider here. If you look right here, this actually has a little remove sticker as well as on the actual heatsink itself. Take these off. So if you peel them, what you'll see is it's sort of like this very, don't touch it, but I'm gonna touch it just to show you. It's like this very like kind of tacky material. It's essentially meant to sort of help pull the heat away from your SSD, dissipate it through the actual heatsink. Definitely make sure to take that off, especially for a board like this. It actually has it both on top and bottom. Normally it only has it on top. For this case, we're actually go ahead and put this one back on because we're only going to install a single SSD. But yeah, if you wanted to, you can install up to 4 SSDs in here. Motherboard would take that no problem. In between our M2 SSD slots is our PCI Express slot. So this is where you will install your graphics card. Again, usually what you're gonna see is that the higher slot is going to be the better one. So you can see it specifically for this case, the top one is metal, where these are plastic, and these plastic ones on the bottom are actually just electrically slower. Technically, you could put a graphics card in either of these bottom ones, but it's gonna have significantly less bandwidth and a whole lot less performance. Don't do that. You're always going to want to install the graphics card in the topmost slot, which again, in this case, is a nice reinforced metal slot, because graphics cards have gotten very heavy. So what you would normally do with the other PCI slots, as well as the little 1X, this would be for something like a capture card or even like a sound card. Most people don't really utilize the additional slots. They're not really as useful as they were. It's definitely a little bit more niche, but that top slot, especially the metal one, 100% always where you're gonna wanna install your graphics card. Moving on down to the bottom of the motherboard, we're gonna have a whole bunch of little connectors. These will be explained more when we're actually installing them in the system, but let me show you them now because once you put it in your case, it's gonna be a lot harder to see. And that's actually just a good, general rule of thumb, right? Before you even start your build, take a few minutes to really familiarize yourself with the motherboard. Most motherboards are very similar, but they're all a little different, right? Especially when it comes to like where they put fan headers, where USB ports are and whatnot. So it's really nice to know where everything is when you look at the motherboard out in the box versus when you have to put it in the case, you got your little phone flashlight out, and you can't see everything. So Just a good idea, so when I tell you later,
Hey, make sure to plug in your USB-C port.
you know exactly where that is because you're not fumbling in the dark. Bottom left pretty much always is going to be your audio. So this is what you will connect to your case. That will power up your things like your headphone jack, your microphone, that kind of stuff. A little bit farther down here, you'll see a couple more fan connectors, which this board has 8 fan headers, which is a lot. I think we're actually gonna be populating a bunch of those though. A little bit farther over, you're gonna see these 2 little 9-pin little connectors that say USB on them. This is specifically for USB 2.0. Some cases will still have USB 2 ports, not a lot, but a lot of times what you're gonna do with this is you'll actually plug it into other accessories in your system. So for example, if you got an AIO with one of those fancy screens, that pretty much is always going to connect not only to power, but also to data via those USB ports. And like I said, it is pretty straightforward to be able to see that this is a 9-pin instead of a 10-pin, entirely because one of those pins being knocked out means it's only going to plug in one way. Directly to the right of that, you'll see your USB 3.0 header. This is going to work in a very similar way. I'll show you when we actually pull the case out. It's a little bit of a bigger, chunkier connector. It's usually blue. This one's more annoying because the connector is badly designed. It's been badly designed for like 15 years now. When you plug it in, it's fine, but this is an easy connector to break off. Like, especially if you ever need to take your motherboard back out, just the way it fits just is very tight. USB 2 is usually on the bottom of the board. This USB 3 connector will pretty much be anywhere. So sometimes it's on the bottom, a lot of times it's on the right edge of the board, but it's always going to look like this. Just a big chunky black connector with 19 pins. If we move over to the bottom right of the motherboard, you'll see our front panel connectors called JFP1. The thing is, unlike most parts of a PC build, which are very much straightforward, so they'll only go in one way, these are a bunch of little individual connectors, and they can go in upside down, wrong side. They're very, very simple to mess up. The good thing is, it's not a big deal. If you put them in wrong, it's not gonna cause any damage, besides your PC won't turn on because you put the power button in the wrong spot. The thing to consider here is that there's a little diagram on the actual motherboard, and this would be one of those cases where you might want to go into the guide because it will explain what each thing is. So, for example, on this motherboard, and most boards at this point, the top 2 left pins are for your power LED, power switch, then you go hard drive LED, and the reset. I'll show you how to install this in a little bit, but I will tell you, make sure you have an idea about this before you put the motherboard in the case, because once you put it in the case, it is so hard to see. These things are very, very tiny. Over here on the right, we will see our SATA connectors. Now SATA again is for things such as a hard drive, maybe an older school SSD, or if you're some kind of physical media lunatic, a Blu-ray drive. So these are all notched. So you'll see that things only are going to go in one way. I'll be honest, most motherboards, or at least most systems these days, probably aren't actually going to use those. But we will be doing it today, so I will show you how to do that. Last but not least, if you move up here, you'll see our USB-C connector. So this would go, if you have any USB-C ports on your case, it will plug in directly here. This is a little bit of a weird connector because it looks like it's symmetrical. It looks like you could do it either way, but you can't. And it's not really easy to tell. So normally what you would do, look really closely, the bottom of it is ever so slightly longer than the top. So it's meant to only go in one way, but it's a little bit annoying to work with. That being said though, it's much more durable because it's made out of metal, unlike the plastic USB 3 headers. So you shouldn't break it. Just as always, if you go to plug it in, it feels like it's really fighting you, maybe see about flipping it around. With that, my friends, that is pretty much all the stuff you need to know about the motherboard. Hopefully you feel a little bit more comfortable with where everything is and how it's all gonna work before you actually start putting some stuff in your board. And then you put your board in the case, and then you do a jig and play some Fortnite, or I don't know. Let's install our CPU. Now, because I am building with an AM5 CPU, I'll show you what that looks like. I dropped it already, that's great. Don't drop your CPU. Now, because I'm building with the 9800X3D, this is an AM5 CPU. The reason why that's important is that it installs a little differently than older AMD stuff, such as AM4. I'll show you both really quick, but let me show you what this one looks like first. So let's go ahead and pull our CPU out. We're gonna get our fancy little Ryzen sticker, and importantly, the CPU itself. So one thing to keep in mind, again, I say this just out of a modicum of caution, treat this a little bit gently. And by gently, I mean don't touch the bottom at all. So when you go to pick it up, grab it from the sides. Now, if you look on the bottom of the CPU, you'll see a whole bunch of little gold contacts. So the way that an AM5 CPU works is that there are pins on the motherboard that touch all of these individual contacts on the back. Now, it's a little different than previous motherboards. Actually, I'll go ahead and show you that really quick. Because if you're building with, say, like an AM4 or something, it is the exact opposite. So this is an AM4 motherboard. So this would have been the last generation AMD, which, to be fair, you can still build today. If I pick up this CPU, what you'll see is that all of the pins are, in fact, on the bottom of the CPU, and there are a bunch of little slots on the motherboard. So basically, for AM5, they flipped that. So they moved all the pins from the CPU to the board. I say all of this just to say, Don't touch the bottom of any CPU no matter what, but especially be careful if it's got 2,000 tiny little gold pins that if you bend them, it is going to make your life very, very difficult. If you're building with an Intel CPU, it is basically going to be this same sort of process. AMD were the last holdouts for that sort of old school pin layout. So if I actually pop this open. Also, fun fact, remember what I said all those times about don't use a lot of pressure when you're putting your PC together? That is true for almost everything except for the CPU. There's this little arm. You see this little retention arm here? It is very, very springy. So this is one of those cases where it's fully okay to use some real pressure. So I'm gonna push it down, pull it out, and release it. So you can see a lot of pressure on that guy. This is the only time in this whole build where you can actually push down on it. Otherwise, you're breaking stuff. Flip the actual socket forward, and you can see here that you have all of your tiny little pins. Again, these are going to be on the motherboard instead of the CPU, and this is basically the exact same setup as Intel. The only thing to keep in mind if you're building with an Intel system is that the Intel sockets are typically, especially these days, are a little bit longer, whereas the AM5 is still square. So when it comes to installing your CPU, there are a few ways to tell which way to do it. It's very simple. The most straightforward one is to look for this little gold triangle on the top of your CPU. It's gonna be on the top left corner. There's a corresponding little triangle on the left of the actual socket. That is pretty much universal no matter whether you're using AMD or Intel. Another way to tell is if you're using one of these AM5 chips, you'll see there's that line that runs slightly below the middle all the way across. There's gonna be a corresponding line on the actual socket. There are also a couple of notches. So basically, the gist of this one is, as you put it in, it should rest very gently with no pressure. It should just slot right into place using gravity. While you can use your force to open and close the arm, you don't wanna ever put your finger on the CPU and go. And again, you see I'm only holding it by the edges, so I'm going to line it up here. I'm going to put it up top first, just very gently. No pressure, just let it sort of rest into place. Ta-da, that's it. Now the way to double check is to look at all four corners. So 1, 2, 3, 4, all are sitting very flat and flush. Once you've done that, you can take your little retention bracket, move it down, and then you'll take your arm, and this is when you can use force, right? So we need to use some pretty good force to push this back into place. All it's doing is making sure the CPU is not gonna escape. Tuck it underneath. Congratulations, you've installed yourself a CPU.
Yay! Good job.
That's a cool person, undoubtedly. Just fun little fact, keep this little retention bracket. Actually, no, I'm not gonna tell you. Who cares? I don't care. No one cares. Now with our specific CPU, you'll see that there's really nothing else in the box. However, if you were using maybe a little bit of a lower end CPU, oftentimes it actually would come with a stock cooler. So for this, we could just put all this stuff aside, but normally this is the point where you would pull out your stock cooler. Since we're not doing that, we're gonna show you how to install a little bit of a beefier, more difficult cooler to install because high-end tutorial, but that's the only other thing that you should find in the CPU box other than your little sticker. Let's move on to our random access memory. Shout out to Daft Punk. Now, the RAM is very straightforward. Odds are, if you've ever worked on a PC, RAM is probably one of the #1 things that you've done before. The only thing to really consider is which slots you actually want to install it in. So the vast majority of motherboards these days will have a little thing. So if actually we look really close here, you'll see right here, it actually will tell you. So there's DIMM A1, A2, B1, B2, and it tells you to populate A2 and B2 first. So that would be slot number 2 and slot number 4. Doesn't hugely matter if I'm honest with you. It should work if you put it in slot 1 or 3, but basically you want to do those two first because it's going to get the maximum speed out of the RAM. So it would work if you do it in the wrong one, just, you know, why would you do that? RAM, like most things with a PC, are relatively durable, but you will generally want to not touch these little gold contacts on the bottom. There are different versions of memory. So this is DDR5. You'll see that they look basically the same, but what they do is they basically move the notch ever so slightly. DDR4 would never fit in a DDR5 slot and vice versa, right? They try to idiot-proof it a little bit for you. If you look here on the actual sort of DIMM slots, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like basically in the middle-ish. But it's also slightly offset, so you can't put it in upside down. And I will tell you, I've built PCs for many a year. I put it in backwards more often than I put it in rightwards. So what you'll do is you'll open up the little retention brackets. So you'll see on either side. Some boards have it only on one side, but you'll just want to open these up. So I'm again doing that in slot 2 as well as slot 4. I'm going to line it up. So you'll put it on one side, put it on the other side, and I did it upside down and backwards like I literally do all the time. One more time, 1 and 2. You'll see that notch is lining up with the notch on the RAM. And then what you do is you put your thumb on both corners and you'll give it some reasonable pressure. Don't push it down super hard if it doesn't look like it's going in, but you want to just put some pretty good pressure until you hear the clicks. So ready, and not a nice sound and click.
but a reassuring one. I like to open the slots beforehand because it's really easy because they're so close to accidentally cross it so you have it in one slot and the other. So line it up. Again, thumb on each side, moderate amount of pressure until you hear the click. That was a way less satisfying click. Oh, because it didn't fully click. Congratulations, you're good. You made it. You got your CPU installed, you got your RAM installed. We're cruising. Let's install an SSD now.
Woo! Nope, don't do that, but woo!
When it comes to your SSD, of course, we're using the 990 EVO Plus. It's pretty straightforward. What you'll see is that, again, remember we were talking about the M2 slots? So that top slot is pretty much always what you're going to want to do. Now, the nice part about this motherboard is that it actually has this little zero toolless dingle donger. If I was gonna install into like, say like this bottom slot or like normal motherboards, one of these little screws that comes with the motherboard, little M2 lockers, you would actually just use a physical screw. But because this is a fancy motherboard, you don't have to use any screws at all. You literally just rotate it around and it holds it in. On the end of your SSD, you will see a little notch. So again, this is only meant to go in one way. It's very simple. So with your plastic removed from any potential thermal pads that are gonna help you keep your SSD cool, you're gonna line it up. You have to do it at a little bit of an angle. So I kind of like to sort of tilt the back of it up and kind of get it lined up here. At that point, I'm gonna use my thumb to push it down. And then I'm gonna spin my little dingle donger around to hold it in place. My dingle donger is too low. Why is it so low?
I thought it was a dingle hopper.
No, the dingle donger. What are you talking about? Dingle
Also,
hopper.
don't call it your
from
dingle donger.
Little
That's
Mermaid.
What's
not
wrong with my dingle donger?
other way.
Oh, you know what I did? I just didn't have it pushed all the way down. Again, if this was a different motherboard, you would just use a screw to do exactly what I just did. But once we're done with that, we'll grab our heatsink. We will carefully peel off. Gonna keep reminding you, peel off the plastic protector. And we're going to line it up with our motherboard. And then we'll just screw it right back down into place. So not only is it installed, but it also should stay nice and cool. So at this point, congratulations. You got yourself a CPU, your RAM, as well as your SSD installed. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 SSDs, obviously you just repeat that same process. So at this point, we can actually put our motherboard off to the side, and it's time to prepare our case. Next step, we're going to work with our PC case, which in this case is very large. It actually is usually a better idea to do this on the floor and pull the case box up, because otherwise it is really hard to pull out a big, heavy case. Oh. Whatever. So we're gonna go ahead and just flip this over real quick.
I think we're gonna need that.
No, it's fine. And then just lift the box up, and it will be much simpler than pulling the case out.
Ooh, watch the mic.
I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make it. Oh, we're close. We're close.
You could pull it forward and then.
Nope. Okay.
Okay.
Also, pro tip, you should keep the case box around not only because it's useful for if you need to return something, but also this is usually my trash box. So as we have all kinds of trash as it kind of builds up, I just like to toss everything in the big old case box so it doesn't go everywhere. So we have a bunch of hardware. A lot of times this is going to be inside the case. This is on the outside. We'll put this aside for a moment, but you're gonna need almost all of this later. Now, every year, I like to do our PC tutorial with a white case. Not only because it looks great for the thumbnail, but also it's a lot easier to see. So just a pro tip, if you're not working in a well-lit environment, some parts of a PC build are hard. Now, this is glass in pretty much every way, and it's white, so it's gonna be pretty easy to see, but most cases are black, most cases don't have this much glass. And while your phone flashlight's great, it is just sometimes hard to see when you're like running cables around and whatnot, so not to say that you should buy a white case just for that reason, but it actually does legitimately make it a little bit easier. So once you've got the case out of the box, the first step is to go ahead and strip it down as much as you can. So normally what that would mean is you're going to take off these little screws on the back. So I'll pop these off here.
Sometimes you might have to take the top off.
Oh, it's magnets.
Oh.
It's magnets, this is so lovely. Generally a good idea to just go ahead and take apart the case as much as you can. So for example, even though there's no fans that are gonna go on the top, it's gonna make our access much easier. Take this off. Keep all the plastic on for right now because you won't want to get all kind of fingerprints on it until you're done. So we'll just set this off to the side. As you can see, nothing holding us back now. Nothing holding me back. No?
Yeah.
I don't know what song you're like. I don't know what song you're singing.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, well, never mind.
No.
There's nothing holding me back. Pro tip, some of these screws are real tight from the factory, so you may want your handy dandy screwdriver to just get them started. I will say, I like the fact that there are magnets on this case. It actually makes it a little bit nicer to sort of line things up. And you can see that this is a very open PC case. So nothing on the top, nothing on the side. Because the O11 Vision is a real fancy boy, this entire motherboard bracket, to my understanding, will slide up and down based on the configuration. I'll say most cases do not have that level of customization. Take off the back panel as well, you'll definitely want to do that. And at this point, we've got the case pretty much opened up. The final form of the PC, your motherboard will be in this sort of general direction. Graphics card's gonna be right about here. We're going to have our all-in-one liquid cooler. We have a 360 millimeter. So we've got 1, 2, 3 120 millimeter fans. They're gonna sit right here. We're also going to be installing some fans. So that's one key difference between this case and honestly the vast majority of cases that you're gonna buy at Micro Center. This has no fans pre-installed. Normally you're gonna have 1, 2, maybe even 3 or 4 fans that are already ready, but because this is a fancy case and it's also designed for maximum customization, we're going to be installing the fans ourselves. I'm gonna explain how you think that process through. There's also a little mesh filter on the bottom here. So basically behind the motherboard, we have our power supply here. We also have the ability to install some hard drives, which you can easily take these out if you're not installing a hard drive to give yourself more space. And then we have all kind of brackets here where you can now install something like a 2.5-inch SSD. But most importantly, lots of room for cables. Clean, simple. I think this thing is gonna look dope when it's done. And at this point, you're really making a choice with a case like this. This is an aesthetic case first and a more advanced sort of system. The reason I say that is because it is glass, 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 which is great for looks, but I'll tell you, if you're lazy with your cable management, if you don't think things through, it's gonna look real ugly real quick. Because guess what? When you got a black case, you got a lot of mesh and not a lot of glass, you can be a little lazy because no one really cares. But when you got a beautiful case like this, every one of these white cables is gonna be ultra obvious. So again, I'm saying this, you can take a lot of these same principles and apply it to a much easier case, which I would probably recommend if this is your first time PC build. But we're going for a system that's gonna look great for my thumbnail. I'm going to figure out the finer details of exactly how I'm gonna configure this build in a minute. But one thing is for sure, we need to install our power supply around the back. Power supplies can actually go in a few different spots depending on your case. Old school cases will put them right about here on the top. The vast majority of power supplies go in the bottom, right about here. Sometimes for a lot of cases, they'll actually have a little basement. So instead of having this all open, you would actually have like a shroud that goes over this. Again, that's probably the most common case you'll see. Let's go ahead and grab our power supply and get cracking. Dribbity toilet.
Oh, why? It could have been anything else.
So for the power supply, this is pretty simple. Wiring, running all your cables, that kind of stuff. It's easy to do it, but it's also kind of hard to do it well, if that makes sense. Again, like if we were working with a easier case, oh my gosh, you can kind of tuck some cables and just kind of like chuck them in the back and no one's gonna notice. But because we've got glass everywhere, we're gonna have to be a little bit more intentional with how we run our cables. But let me actually show you the power supply first, as well as explain the different types of power supplies that you might use for a system like this. A lot of times for PC builds, you actually can start with a power supply. Like doing the motherboard or the power supply first doesn't really matter. Just for this build, I wanted to get the motherboard all ready and set and kind of pushed off to the side. But you want to make sure that the power supply is in before you put your motherboard or anything else in. Because you really want your power cables roughly where they should be before you have to like reach around the motherboard or try to like figure out your cable runs or whatever like that. So I like to put the power supply in, if not first, at least before the motherboard goes into the case. So we pop this guy open. We'll see as a helpful tip to plug your cables all the way in instead of 2/3 of the way in. So this is a fully modular power supply. So what that means is if I pick up the power supply, there are exactly 0 cables attached. So all the cables you use, you're going to attach yourself. So look around to the back of the power supply, you'll see your IEC. So that's just where you'll be able to plug into the wall. And then on the other side, you'll see all kind of individual cables. The advantage with a power supply like this is that you can plug in only the cables that you need. So that's what this little pouch is full of. So you have, honestly, way more cables than we actually need, right? I mean, this is it's a lot. But the advantage of a modular power supply is that you're only plugging in exactly what you need, which is nice because if I had, say, a non-modular power supply, all of these cables are here all the time. The difference is this is going to be a cheaper option. However, it is going to make your cable management a lot more difficult because basically, again, for a build like this, half these cables I don't need, but they're stuck to the power supply. So I got to like tuck them in and everything. Both are fine. It's really much more of a matter of, do you want a cleaner aesthetic and a little bit of an easier build? Also, I will mention there's a semi-modular power supply option, a little bit rarer, but those will essentially give you like the handful of cables that you will always use. Those will just be hardwired in, and then you plug in the extra stuff. But generally speaking, modular, higher end, better for cable management. Non-modular, totally fine, just a little bit harder because those extra cables, you just gotta tuck them out of the way. And for a system like this, I don't want any extra cables to deal with. I want it to be as smooth, clean, and streamlined as possible. I say a lot of this
because you need to make some decisions if you have a modular power supply right now before it goes into the case. That is largely going to come down to your PC configuration. I'm going to show you what I'm going to use for this system, right? If you're building a different system, you will certainly have a different selection of, say, PCI connectors, or maybe you need a single 8-pin or whatever the case is. But I'm going to show you what I need for this and also run you through exactly how it all works.
And it never hurts to just plug everything in and figure it out later.
You can, but here's the thing. For optimal cleanliness and neatness of your cables, if you only plug in the cables you need now, you don't have to deal with it. Because basically, think about it like this. When you install your power supply, it is going to sit in here like this. Wedge it in here. So you'll see it'll sit nice and flush. But when it comes to the actual cables, you don't have like a huge amount of space, right? So if I plugged all these cables in and tried to unplug them later, it's a pain, right? It's very kind of hard to get them in. So for the purpose of the tutorial, I'm going to plug in only the cables that I need for the build right now. Although in a little bit later, once we actually go to plug all this stuff into your components, I will explain what each of these cables do, where it plugs in, how that whole thing works. But for now, I'm gonna do a little cooking channel magic where I'm gonna put the power supply under the table, plug everything in, and bring it back up, and it's gonna be magically ready. So see, now that I'm plugged in, ta-da! They told me I need to plug all the cables in because otherwise this wouldn't be a thorough tutorial. So I gotta undo half these cables when I'm done showing you what they do!
They need to know what everything does.
Fine. So for a case like this, again, a lot of cases you'll just slide it into the bottom, but because this is a fancy boy, we're gonna move our little door back and we're going to line it up here. One thing to consider, no matter what kind of power supply you're using, make sure that the fan has access to cool air. So for example, for this case, there's only one way to do it, which would be to have the fan pointing outward. Because imagine if it went this way, it would be sucking air against a solid piece of metal. Most of the time, you'll want to have the power supply facing downward, and there'll be a little like mesh vent if you're doing like a little basement style. Or if you're putting it on the top of the case, again, it would probably be on the bottom, so you can pull air directly in and exhaust it off the back. But in this case, there's only one way to do it, which is have that fan pointing toward the back, where we will have plenty of mesh to give it some fresh air. It's gonna be a little tight, but it should fit in like that. And there we go. So we'll just let it sit there. If you look into the box that your power supply came in, you should see a few little baby screws. Yeah, right here. There's gonna be 4 little baby screws. These are what we use to screw the power supply into place. These always come with your power supply. Sometimes your case will come with some extra spare screws, but your power supply should always come with 4 screws to install it. So you'll see there's gonna be a hole in each corner. So there's 1, there's 2, 3, 4. This one's a little bit sort of offset. Now, one thing is, it's not really important for the actual power supply, but it is just a good general sort of thing to learn, is to install things with the cross pattern. What I mean by that, so we're gonna start on this bottom corner. So we'll go ahead and just screw it in. And then what you'll do is you'll wanna use a screw on the opposite corner. So I'm gonna install it here. And we're gonna do the opposite corner. Power supply, like I said, not really an item that's gonna go anywhere, generally speaking. But, you know, good general rule, use all the screws. If you use 2, I wouldn't tell on you, but, you know, that power supply, not going anywhere. Also, while you're back here, little pro tip, make sure that you're switched on. So the O is obviously off and the 1 is on. I cannot tell you how many times I built a PC, plugged it all in, hit the power button, nothing happened because I forgot to turn the power supply back on. So while you're here, go ahead and flip it on. Don't plug it in yet, but at least have that power switch on. So once you actually do plug it in, you're all done. You don't have a heart in your throat moment when you realize your giant cool gaming PC doesn't work because you forgot to turn the power supply on. Those astute among you may have noticed something missing in my case, which is not only the PC, but also any fans. Now, that's a little bit unusual. Most systems actually already come with fans pre-installed. So take, for example, this, which is a PC that already has 2 fans in the front, 2 fans on the top, and 1 fan in the rear. That's a pretty normal configuration. You're gonna see that in a lot of cases right out the box. This is actually completely fine, and honestly, if your case has fans pre-installed, leave them. They're doing their job, they're already setting up for intake, exhaust, yada, yada, yada. However, because this case does not have any fans installed, it means that not only do I get to have a lovely conversation with you about airflow and the benefits of positive versus negative pressure, but also it's a good time to think about how air moves in your system. The way that this one's set up, first of all, there's a lot less airflow, right? Glass on the front, glass on the side, and importantly glass on the top, which is kind of unusual, which means that all of our air has to come from the bottom, from the back, and from this rear sort of portion here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move my motherboard tray
So very few cases actually allow you to do this. But what this allows us to do is install a second 120mm fan on the rear right in front of me. So by default, you install one, pretty much for all cases. However, when we have two, it means we can actually do something a little bit cool, which I'm going to actually install them both as intake. You know, that case I showed you earlier, it had the exhaust in the back and the intake in the front. I'm gonna flip that. So with the system I'm building, I'm gonna install 3 fans on the bottom. So 1, 2, 3. These are going to be intaking cool air from below the system, right? So that is going to largely feed our graphics card, which is going to live right about here. I'm also going to have 2 120mm fans in the back, which are going to be pulling in cool air, largely for the benefit of the motherboard, and that should hopefully flow through here, and then I'm going to have the 3 fans on my AIO, which is going to be exhausting all of that hot air. So by the time air hits this, it's going to be pretty toasty. It's going to go right out the back of the case. Now, this is a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but importantly, it is going to mean that we should have pretty good airflow, pretty good thermals, and because there's so much glass in this, I'm hoping a fairly quiet system. Now, it's important to consider, there's no really wrong way of doing this. You know, if you put all your fans in random directions, your PC is still gonna work fine. Is it gonna be a little warm? Probably. Is your fan noise going to be louder than it needs to be? Yes. But this is sort of the fun part of if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty and tweak things and sort of experiment, you can certainly do that. But for this, I'm going to keep it relatively streamlined. A lot of intake, exhaust, and importantly, my clean aesthetic. Who wants to watch a boring PC tutorial where I just say, you know, the case fans, just leave them there.
People watch these?
So for this build, I'm going to show you how to install 2 types of fans. So first of all, we have this. This is the Montech fan. This is a normal fan. So you're going to use 4 screws to mount it up. You have 2 leads. So you have one, which is going to be for the actual fan itself. And you're going to have one for the RGB. However, we're also going to show you how to install these Lian Li Unifans, which are the more expensive, fancy way of installing cool fans in your system. The first thing to consider when it comes to installing a fan is just knowing which side is which. So in the vast majority of cases, again, this system's a little different for a couple reasons, you're gonna see that the label is going to denote which direction the airflow is going. Except when you buy a reverse fan, which says reverse on the back, which means it is the opposite. So if you look at the fan that I've already installed here, normally this would be exhaust, right? So you would see the RGB on this side, you see the label, and it would be exhausting out this side. However, because I bought reverse fans I want to intake, it is actually pulling air in. The reason why I bought the reverse fan is because it is actually going to still show my RGB. Because fans pretty much always only have RGB on one side, and because most fans are designed in a normal configuration, they're blowing air from the RGB side back. It makes sense, right? If this is on the top of your case, it's blowing the air out, you get to see the RGB ring, that's great. But because again, we're doing this all a little bit weird, I bought some reverse blade fans, and now I'm going to be sucking air in, even though it looks like I'm exhausting it. That seems very complicated. Does that make sense to you? Are you following? Are you falling asleep already? Are you just sleeping? So to install our fan, it's very straightforward. But before we do that, I will say, consider where your fan cable is going to go. So I'll just show you as an example. If I just line it up like this is a fully functional fan, except that my cable's on the wrong side, which means I would have to wrap it around. It's gonna be all ugly. I wanna be clear that you shouldn't spend a lot of time cable managing before you finish a build. However, some just quick little looks at maybe rotating the fan to be a little bit of a better orientation. There's like little things you can do as you're building to make your life a lot easier. Otherwise, you're gonna be lazy and just never do it right. So for this, I'm actually gonna think about this. I'm gonna put the fan right here. So if I have the cable on this side, I could run it up. I could also run it down, but I don't know if I'm gonna have the space for that. Actually, I might have to run it up. From here, we're gonna do exactly the way we install all of our components, which is to do it in a cross pattern. So we're gonna do the bottom right, and we'll do the top left. With fans, you can kind of have a little bit of rotation on them. I want my fans to touch, or very, very closely, not quite touch, but be as close as possible. So as long as you are making sure to not pinch any of your cables, so see that I have plenty of room here where I can run that later, and I can still make sure that's straight, which it looks pretty straight to me. We'll put our other screws in, and then these fans are basically good to go. At least until you need to plug them all in. But as far as installing goes, very, very simple. Now you should always use all 4 screws for fans, but if for some reason you only use 2, I didn't tell you you could do that. With that, we have our 2 intake fans installed. We also have the Lian Li Unifans for this system. Now Lian Li have used some creativity to engineer a fan that requires no cables. Asterisk, it does a little bit. But the important thing is you can actually daisy chain these fans together. So instead of having 2 cables coming from each one of these, we can attach them all together and we just have a couple of cables that go out the end, which makes it a lot easier to do cable management. And also these are really nice fans. In fact, you can actually get these with like screens in the middle and whatnot. These are kind of the most popular cool fans you can buy. Certainly on the expensive side, especially with a white system like this, where your black cables would be very noticeable. We can make this look a whole lot neater. So you'll see that all these fans are the same. So on one side, you'll have this series of pens. On the other side, you'll have this series of pads, and they have these little notches. So what you do is you just line them up, something like this, and then just click them together. Now you got a little 2-fan configuration. Want to add one more? No big deal. Make sure it's even pressure so it doesn't pop out on one side, which it likes to do. And boom, look at that. We got our 360mm fan all ready to go. So these fans come with a couple of different cables. So for this particular case, we don't need to use these little extenders. So you just plug these in if you wanted to have like say 2 here and 3 here or something. But what it does come with is this little brick. So this is going to be a little hub that will attach to our PC that will control not only the fan speed, but also things like our RGB. If we just plug in one cable, we should plug that into the side of our fan. It's a little hard to see, but you've got your pens here on the side, and we're gonna plug this cable into it. And when you do that, it actually covers up the other cables too. So basically the whole thing will be nice and safe. So now, before I actually load this all up, let me just give this a quick thought to figure out how I wanna do this. Because technically, I could actually install this in 2 different locations. So I could install it all the way to this side, so basically all the way back to this end, or I could slide it forward a little bit. No, I'm gonna push it farther forward, because otherwise we're gonna be sort of impacting that back slot. Also, I'm just realizing, why is this a slightly different shade of white? It's white, but like, off-white. You see the difference?
A little bit.
This is like silver. This is light silver.
It's fine. Once you turn the RGB on, you won't notice the difference.
I'm gonna go ahead and install these fans with lots and lots of little screws, and I'll be right back. Now it is time to install our motherboard. So it's always good to put your PC down flat on the table, and it's pretty straightforward. The only thing that might be a little different based on what kind of motherboard you have is going to be the I/O shield. So for this board, the I/O shield is already integrated, so I don't have to do anything. If you have mostly like an older or cheaper motherboard, what you do is this will be like a separate plate, and what you would do is you would just line it up and snap it in right here. We're gonna have some helpful B-roll from my 2019 tutorial to show you how to do that right now. See? Look how easy that is. So this is an ATX motherboard, and because this is an ATX chassis, all of my standoffs are already in place. So you see that all of these little silver, or sometimes they're gold, they're made of brass. These are all installed here. If they're not installed, you will get a little tool. So Lee and Lee are very helpful. They give you a nice little case screw holder, which will also have some of these additional standoffs. So remember in the earlier part of the video where I was explaining sort of the different sizes of motherboards? Because this is designed for ATX, I could install ATX. I could also move these screws up here and do a micro, or I could even do a mini ATX if I wanted a very small little motherboard. What you do is you take your motherboard, again, you just want to generally hold it a little bit more by the corners, especially because it's very sharp on the bottom with lots of little pokey bits. You're gonna want to line it up. First of all, you're gonna use the I/O shield because that's usually gonna help to kind of get you in the right sort of ballpark. Some cases will have a little centering peg, usually right here. This one doesn't, but that'll help to kind of like center the whole thing up. So at this point, before you would even think about putting a screw in, not only make sure that all of your screw holes are lined up, so you can see that I'm very slightly off, so I'm just gonna pull it in a little bit on the top. And then as well as take a look at your I/O shield. Especially if you're installing the metal I/O shield yourself, it's not built in. It's really easy for the ports to either get sort of caught by maybe like a cable, like your fan cable, or the I/O shield will have like these little metal pins to help kind of like center it. If anything is blocking any of these ports, now's the time to fix it, because trust me when I say, if you build your whole system, you turn it on, you go plug your USB in, and you realize that there's a little piece of metal blocking your USB port, it sucks because you pretty much have to tear your entire PC apart. Once you've done that, then you can just massage it into place. Sometimes you just put a little bit of force just to make sure it's centered, and then we can start screwing it in with our included case screws. So now you want to go into the box or the bag of hardware that your case came with and find these little screws. Now, if you're unsure of which screw to use, take a look. There's usually a little instruction manual. Maybe it's online. It will tell you what kinds of screws you're looking for. It's the little guy with the, like, it looks like a washer on the bottom of it.
I think it's called a truss.
A what?
A truss screw?
Okay, I've built PCs for many years. I have never known a name for the screw besides the little duder. Now, the only slight downside here, because I've already installed these fans, it's gonna be a little hard to get to this one on the corner, so I'm gonna start with that one to make sure that we can get it all centered up. Now, when you're doing these screws, do not do them very tight, at least to start. So just get them started, make sure that it's in there, and then that next like second and third screws, that's where you're really gonna wanna like square the board up. Even with a motherboard that has like a little centering pin that a lot of like cases will come with to kind of keep it lined up. Like right now, it's very close, but it's ever so slightly off. So I know that before I put that next screw in, I'm gonna have to just give it a little bit of pressure to make sure it's lined up. Take your time, no big rush, all good. We're gonna go ahead and go to the opposite corner. So I started on the bottom right, so I'm gonna go to the top left. Again, I'm not doing it super tight, just enough to kind of keep it in place. I will start tightening things up in just a second once I know that everything is very, very square. So I'm gonna do this top corner now because that one looks like it's a little bit off. So this one, even though it's a slightly bit off, I think as I screw it in, it's gonna help center the board. Yeah, there we go. So at this point, all you gotta do is continue to go around, make sure, especially when it comes to the motherboard, use all of the screws. Yes, technically it will hold if you do like 4 or 5 screws, but I will tell you that graphics cards are heavy and you don't want it to fall out and collapse all over the place. So make sure to screw it in, not like ultra tight, because I will say that if you do it like super, super tight, it's easy to actually strip these screws. So when you go to take out the motherboard later for any reason, it'll get stuck to the standoff. So don't go like crazy mode or anything, but just make sure nice and tight. And you've gone all the way around. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Did I count 7? It's 9.
Well, I was also wrong. That screw is called the main board fixed screw.
A main board fixed screw, that's what it's called?
Yes. I'm more confident.
How am I learning this for the first time in my life?
Maybe we should have Alex do the tutorial.
Alex, do you want to take over?
He seems to know more.
No.
It's really fun, trust me. Especially after you do like 10, 11 of these things, it's great. It's really fun.
I did do like 4 when you were gone.
You did. You actually taught everyone in the office how to build a PC. So now our motherboard is installed, and with a lot of great confidence, it's time to flip our case over and watch our motherboard not fall out. My favorite part. There are a bunch of cables in the back, including a hard drive adapter. I was gonna take this out anyway. I did that on purpose. Hilarious timing for me to make a little extra space in the back. This is not a bit for the video. You should actually take your hard drive adapters out if you're not using them. That was a really loud clunk.
Oh, nothing's gonna fall out of here. Clunk.
But look. Motherboard is motherboarding. Lovely and delightful up front. Look at that. Doesn't this look like a 64% complete computer to you?
Yeah, maybe like 63.
There we go. This is a 3.5-inch drive bay. So if you're using a hard drive, you're going to be using one of these guys. Now, as you can see, it's optional because most people don't use these anymore. So I actually have 2 in the back. I actually did mean to take one out. I just forgot that I didn't fully pull it out. So because we're using one hard drive, we're gonna do that. But essentially, good rule of thumb, you wanna take this kind of stuff out because it'll give you more space. It'll give you more space to do cable management, tuck extra cables if you don't have a modular power supply. It's actually nice to basically clear anything out that you're not going to use. Just keep all of this kind of stuff, your hardware, all that kind of stuff somewhere handy. So if you ever do want to add an extra hard drive, you can just throw it in this guy and put it in. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. A lot of my cable management, plugging in cables and whatnot is going to happen later. However, there are some cables that I like to plug in now. So as you can see, especially with a case like this, where it's all wide open, I have a lot of room to run cables back through here. There's a lot of space, super easy. First of all, a lot of cases don't give you that much space, so that's a thing. But on top of that, as you install more and more components, it gets much more difficult to reach certain things. So this is a good point where I like to go and plug in some of the things I have to do, and I also want to have the most amount of access to. So, shall we begin the Austin's Plugorama Corner? Austin's Plugorama Corner is here. Let me start running through things that you should plug in before we continue along with our build. First cable I'm gonna look for is our 20+4 pin. So I'm gonna go ahead and route that around. So for this, I'm gonna run it right here. So you see we have these rubber grommets, and this is gonna be all over the case. It's pretty normal in most cases, where you're gonna have a nice little way to hide your cable here. Remember the little connector on the side of the board? This is our main power. This is only gonna go in one way because it does have this sort of little clip on the end. So all I gotta do is rotate this around, trying to keep the cable roughly lined up as much as possible. Then line it up until you hear the click. Boom. And then we're just gonna tuck that cable so it's a somewhat neat looking bend. This is more so for aesthetics. That looks a little goofy, but I mean, there's only so much we can do. Next up, let's find our CPU power. For the purposes of this tutorial, I plugged in all of my connectors from the motherboard because I want to explain each and every one of these. I'm going to only be using some of these. I'm going to remove them because they're ugly and silly, but I'm going to show you how to do it. So your CPU power is always going to be on the top of the board. Now I actually have two choices here. I could run it through this grommet, but because I moved the motherboard down, I'm actually going to run it below. I think I've got the space and I do. The CPU connector is technically two 4-pins, so I can actually break this apart and show you. If you're using a really old motherboard, you actually sometimes only need a single 4-pin. That's pretty rare though. Almost all PCs at this point are going to at least need an 8-pin, and this actually needs two 8-pins. So this has a little clip on the top, so again, it's only going to go in one way. So I'm going to rotate it around and line it up, and again, it should click. And there you go. And because this is a relatively high-end power supply, I do have a second 8-pin, which I will pull across here and do the exact same thing with. So you just feed it through. So rotate my cable around, plug the second one in, and again, I'm gonna pull that cable so that it looks something kind of neat like that, right? What I'm not doing right now is zip tying anything or tying anything down. I'm just trying to run the cables where they need to go and through the most sort of convenient sort of outlet that I can, right? Do not zip tie anything until your PC is done, all right? But if you can run it in a nice sort of clean way, it takes you 2 extra seconds and it makes it much easier, because otherwise you're gonna test your system and go, cool, and then you gotta unplug half the stuff and try to run it nice and neat. Like, this takes no time, very, very simple. So for now, we're going to leave the rest of our power supply cables off to the side. We do not need to plug these in just yet. And instead, we're going to move over to our case cables. Case cable sounds like a weird way to say that, but if you look around back here, in fact, I'll just rotate and show you. There are all kind of cables that are attached directly to your case. So attached to the case, we're going to have things such as our USB 3.0 connector. That is going to be powering the USB ports on the front of the case, as well as we have our USB-C. We have our front panel connector, as well as our audio. All of these are going to need to be plugged directly into the motherboard. And again, all the stuff from the case really is going to be for things such as your power button, your USB ports, your audio jacks, that kind of stuff. Again, I'm gonna keep saying it over and over again. This case, while it has some sort of negatives as far as complication, there's a lot of space, so it makes it really easy. A lot of systems, especially when you start loading it up, it's really hard to reach some of these connectors. So doing it in sort of the most optimal order definitely helps. And this is a perfect time to plug a lot of this stuff in while we have nice and sort of plenty of access, and before we've installed a giant GPU that just gets all up in our way. So I'm gonna start with my USB-C connector. So we're gonna route that right underneath our 20+4 pin. This is gonna be slightly different on every motherboard, so that's why it's nice. We have all the space to run cables. So I'm gonna run it right through here. Keep in mind that, again, it is not completely symmetrical. So once you're mostly confident that you've got it ready, you just line it up. There's not gonna be anything that's gonna keep you, actually here, I'll show you how to do it wrong first, right? So if I try to do it wrong, watch what happens. It just doesn't go in, right? See, doesn't do anything. So if it does that, flip it over, does the opposite direction, till it clicks, boom. Very simple. You're not gonna mess this one up, if I'm honest with you. I mean, no, wait, let me rephrase that. You're probably not gonna mess this one up. It's pretty straightforward. So once that's firmly seated, we're gonna then move on to our USB 3.0. Now, this board has the two USB 3.0s. So it has one here and one here. I'm gonna do the one on the side because I think that's gonna be a little bit of a neater cable run. Before you install your USB 3.0 connector, keep in mind, this has a notch, so it only goes in one way. Do not force this one if you've accidentally got it upside down, right? That should be pretty self-explanatory. But as you install it, try to do it very much sort of like square. Don't kind of like push it on one side or the other, whatever, because again, these connectors are kind of fragile. I've broken several of them over the years. I don't like the design of it. So you'll see here, we've got our notch up. So the notch is corresponding here. So we're double checking that. So when you line it up, make sure that it is as even as possible before you apply any pressure, right? So we're totally lined up, and then I give it some beans. There we go. Okay, that's in. No additional pressure. Once it's in, leave it alone. I'll pull the rest of the cable aside. This, I will say, this board is actually pretty nice, so that cable feels like it went in a little bit nicer than normal. And there we go. We have our front USB 3.0 ports as well as our USB-C ready to go. Very simple, very easy. Now, this case does not have any USB 2.0 ports, but because we're using the Lian Li Unifans, it does use USB 2.0 to work with the actual little hub. So this is just a little micro USB cable that you plug into the bottom. It's actually probably more common for you to plug in some kind of like hub or accessory to your USB 2.0 versus the actual case. So regardless, these are the little guys on the bottom here. You're gonna start to see that because I've already installed these fans, it's gonna get in my way a little bit. Now, it's not a big deal because I have plenty of space. However, if at any point you can't reach the cable very well, it's a huge pain, don't be afraid to like pop something like this out. It's no big deal. So we're gonna pull our USB 2 header from our hub out. So again, if you look at the actual connector, there's one pin knocked out, so it is only gonna go in one way. And then just push it directly in, and then just tuck the excess right out of the way. Super simple, super easy. So our hub is now connected, or theoretically that could be any number of accessories or even like some kind of USB 2.0 port on the front of your case. So you gotta be really mindful of this because that's a big old black cable with a bunch of different colors, so I wanna make sure that is not super obvious, but it should be fine. Next up, we're going to install our front panel connectors, which is another cable that is coming from our case. As the name implies, it's front panel, stuff like your power button and whatnot. So you'll see that this is in the form of a little brick. So it looks very similar to USB 2, although you'll see it does say front panel on the front. If you're using an older case that has the individual breakout connectors, that's totally fine. It is a little bit annoying, a little bit fiddly, which is why you want to do this earlier in the process rather than later so you actually can see and plug things in. As you install these little connectors, just keep in mind that if you flip them over to the back, there's going to be a little arrow on one side, usually on the left side. That denotes the positive. So if you look at your motherboard manual, it will have a little pinout, and that will basically tell you, positive and negative for your front panel connector, or for your hard drive LED, or for your reset button, or whatever the case is. Don't worry if you mess one of these up, the worst thing that's gonna happen is that your power button's not gonna work, right? Flip it over, do it again, no big deal. However, the good thing is, most cases like this don't require you to do that anymore, because it's gonna put it all together on this little brick. And when you see this, it is very simple. You're gonna plug it in the exact same way as your USB 2 or your audio, which we're gonna do in a second. So as you go to install this, you'll see that there's a pin that's missing on the top right. That's gonna correspond to a pin missing on the front panel connector, which means all you gotta do is line it up and give it just a little bit of force. You don't have to push it too hard. And boom, our front panels are good. And then we will, as always, tuck a little bit of that excess cable out of the way. Next up, we're going to be installing our front panel audio. So this is always going to be on the bottom left of the board. This is going to be for stuff such as your headphone jack and your microphone jack. This connector looks almost the same as the USB 2. It is just going to have a pin knocked out in a different position. So it's going to be the number 8 pin right here. You'll see that there's a corresponding pin knocked out here, all the way in. Tuck the excess, boom. We're actually making really good progress. Don't mind the massive cables on the back. We have now installed our motherboard, we've got our power supply installed, we've got our fans mostly ready to go. Now that we've got a lot of the cabling out of the way, it is the perfect time to switch gears to your CPU cooler. Now, this is a choose your own adventure game, my friends. Wow, that's really uneven now that I've got it propped up. If you are using a stock cooler, something like an Intel or an AMD cooler that comes in the box, it is incredibly simple. They're slightly different based on AMD versus Intel, but you'll basically just line it up and push the little pins in. Super simple. However, if you're building a little bit of a higher end system, that is where you need to make your choice between air and water cooling. Now, as you probably know, we have chosen a liquid AIO for this build. However, thank you very much, Alex. If you were to say go with an air cooler, I can show you how that would work as well. So the way these will normally work, and actually, you know what? Hang on, before I tell you that, check the manual for every cooler you ever install. Because I swear, they're very similar in some cases. But then they like to make it a little sneaky on you. Like, oh, by the way, what if you install the bracket upside down because we like to be all special and cool. So definitely refer to the manual for whatever particular cooler you're installing. But the way that CPU coolers, specifically air coolers, work is that there's going to be a little flat area on the bottom, typically with copper heat pipes. So you'll see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on this particular cooler. And you would just line it up something like that, and then the CPU cooler would be able to do its thing. Usually pretty straightforward, just a couple of screws that would sort of mount up here and up here. But I'm not gonna go super in depth on this because it is gonna very much depend on which brand of cooler you use. Generally speaking though, CPU air coolers are, I find, much easier to install. Because as you'll see in a second, when you install an AIO, you've got a bunch of fans, you've got a radiator, you still gotta mount the pump. It's not difficult, mind you, but it's definitely a little bit more involved than you can put an air cooler in 15 minutes. An AIO usually is gonna take you 45 minutes. But we're going to go ahead and move into the liquid domain. Someone call Pokemon Sapphire. Kyogre's here.
What?
It's gonna be a water spout inside my CPU cooler.
Why do you say words?
I'm just a big fan of Drizzle. One of the best abilities.
Shut up about Pokemon, son.
That's a good one. So when it comes to installing your AIO, I will emphasize that you should follow the instruction manual on whatever cooler you are installing. Certain parts, though, are going to be pretty universal. So, for example, installing your radiator. So this is known as a 360 millimeter radiator, which is because it has 3 120 millimeter fans on it. If you're installing an AIO, odds are you're going to do a 360. Sometimes you'll do a 240, but oftentimes a 360. Now it's going to look better, but it's going to give you more performance. And the way this is going to work is just like where we installed the fans on our case, you're going to use the screws to mount it up. So you've got the same kind of idea here, and that the fans are going to be pushing air through. So because this is our exhaust, we want to make sure that the labels are facing toward us. The backs of the fans are actually up to the radiator. So we know the airflow is going in this direction. Radiators, I would say, are basically all of the time exhaust. I can't think of a mainstream radiator setup that you would use as an intake. I mean, technically, I guess you could, but they're pretty much always meant for exhaust, usually on the top of your case or in the back. So that's what we're gonna be doing here. It will be mounted something like this once we're actually all done. When it comes to installing your fans to the radiator, you'll want to use the long screws because these screws will go all the way through the fan and go into the radiator. Now, they're technically the same thread as the little guys, but obviously the little guys won't go all the way through. So the little guys are much more meant for either connecting a fan directly to your case, or importantly for this, we're going to be using these in the back of the radiator to mount it to the actual bracket here. So I say that because technically the long screws, if you just kept screwing them, would actually pinch into your radiator. Once you've got your fans attached, and again, you can see that I ran all my cables on this one side so that they're all going to be coming through this cable management here. And then the actual pump needs to go on your CPU. I've already taken the liberty of installing our little bracket. Refer to your manual on whatever cooler you're using. So for this one, I'm using the stock bracket that came with the motherboard, and I just have to swap out these screws and these little spacers. So that'll be roughly what it looks like. Keep in mind that when you're using an AIO, the tubing you want to try to keep, it's not gonna be straight, but you want to try to keep from kinking it too tightly. It's not the smoothest bend, but honestly, you're always gonna have a little bit of pressure on these. Technically, you can sometimes like rotate it around, but I find is that if you do that, the bend looks way tighter. So I'd actually rather a little bit more of a gentle radius on this. So before we install the actual pump itself, what we're gonna wanna do is show you how to do thermal paste. If you see on the bottom of this, we actually already have some pre-applied thermal paste, which is this gray stuff on the actual copper sort of bottom of our pump. Now, if this is on your cooler, and honestly most coolers do have pre-applied thermal paste, it's totally fine, use it, it's all good. However, if you like maybe just a touch more performance, or if you're reinstalling this later, you don't usually want to reuse this thermal paste, let me show you how to install it. We're going to install the thermal paste not to our cooler, but to our CPU itself. Normally, this will actually come with the cooler, so either the cooler is going to have thermal paste already applied, or it's going to give you a little tube that you can apply. You can obviously buy this separately, and again, there are different types of thermal paste. So thermal paste is what is going to allow your CPU to make solid contact with the cooler. Whether it be air or liquid, it doesn't matter, you're always going to want thermal paste. Now, you want to use a moderate amount of this. So old school builds, you would use like a grain of rice. That's what I told for many years. However, CPUs have gotten bigger, and most importantly, they've gotten significantly more power hungry. So what I like to do is the 4 corners in the middle. So what we'll do is we'll start on the top corner. We'll go 1, 2, 3, that's a little bit messy, 4, and do a little bit more in the middle, like that. So when it comes to applying your thermal paste, I like to do a little bit more rather than not quite enough. So that's why I like to do on the 4 corners as well as on the middle. Now, if you do extra thermal paste, that's fine. It's not gonna cause a problem. The only downside is when you go to swap out your CPU, sometimes there's a little extra that kind of gets like sort of caked around the edges and whatnot. Not ideal, but it's not that big of a deal. However, if you don't do enough, what'll happen is everything will work fine, but you don't have that super solid sort of connection between your cooler and the CPU, and that can mean that you're running at higher temperatures, especially maybe like you got like a hot spot on one corner because it's all gooped on the bottom or whatever. So a nice even coat of thermal paste is really all you need. Let's install our cooler, my friends. So what I like to do is I like to start with the actual pump before I do the radiator. It's nice to have a little bit of extra flexibility with the tubing. So I'm just gonna kind of, again, put this generally in the right spot. This would be a great time to mention, I have not followed my own advice. There's a mess all over the table of screws I did not keep nice and organized. That's fine, I'll clean it up after, off camera.
Seems like an Alex problem.
No, I'll do it. So for this cooler, I have 4 of these little thumb screws. So you see we've got our 4 little screws already mounted. So I'm just gonna line it up here. Now, one thing is once you go to install this, think about it like this. Once that thermal paste touches, you don't want to pull it back off, right? So once I actually push it all the way down, I'm gonna use one hand to apply pressure to make sure that thermal paste is sort of staying in place. Well, as we screw it down, it'll kind of push it more and more down. Basically, if you push it down, pull it back, push it down, pull it back, that thermal paste gets all sort of separated. It's not gonna be quite as even of an application. So I'm gonna do my best. So I'm gonna line it up with 2 hands, make sure it is as even as possible on all 4 sides. Cool, and that is applied. Now I'm gonna do a little twisty action, and I'm going to start using my thumb screws. Now, if you have listened to me in this tutorial, the most important thing is you should use the cross pattern here. Most everywhere else I told you to use the cross pattern is nice. This you have to do, because if you do, say, top 2 first, what you're gonna do is you're gonna put all the torque on the top of that cooler. It is not gonna make an even connection. So please do this on a cross pattern. So I've done the top left, I'm now gonna do the bottom right. You don't have to do this super tight, don't worry about that. Just make sure that it is sort of just like very loosely finger tight. Once you got the first 2, you can let go, it will hold. So just get them all, like I said, just sort of slight to moderate finger tight for now. You don't have to worry about it just yet. You just wanna make sure that's sort of in position. And then we will get the screwdriver out and then we will start tightening it. Don't rush this part, because one of the things we're doing here is we're sort of spreading that thermal paste out, and it's important that you want to make sure that it's a nice sort of even and very flush fit between your CPU and the cooler. You want it to be as flush as possible. With these, I'm actually gonna go a little bit more on fingers before I go to the screw. Basically, get it as tight as you can with your fingers, and you use the screw to kind of like finish it off. So you can see right now, what I've done is I've gotten them all pretty much evenly finger tight. So at this point, now I can go around with the screwdriver and tighten each one all the way down. Now, if you have to do a couple rounds, that's fine. So I'm gonna go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So you don't wanna go like crazy hard, but you want it to basically be about firm to the point where the screwdriver's not really moving too much. That RG logo's upside down, isn't it? It's fine. It's one of those rotatable bezels, right? Oh boy. So this in no way affects the functionality, but I gotta do that again because I don't wanna look at an upside down logo. This is definitely meant to go the other direction, which means it is going to be a much tighter bend. I actually don't like that. I wish that they would have given me the option of rotating this whole thing around, because this is definitely a much sort of nicer radius to go to that side. This is where a great motto that was once taught to me many years ago of measure once, cut twice really applies. Why do it right the first time? Well, you can pretend that that was the practice run and redo it all one more time. So I'll see you tomorrow when I've flipped this whole thing around and, you know, installed it the right way, even though it's not the way I want to do it. Now that I have correctly oriented the AIO, which a lot of AIOs let you rotate it around for aesthetics, but no, apparently not with this one. Anyway, let me show you how to install the rest of this. So again, this guy's mounted, but our radiator's still loose. Before I actually bolt the radiator in, you're gonna notice we have a whole mess of cables coming not only from our fans, but also from the pump itself. So there should be 3 sets of these 4 pins, which are for the actual fans to spin. And you'll also have your little 3-pin RGB headers. So they will all go into this little breakout cable. So just like any other fan connector, they're notched, they're only going to go in one way. That's one. So we'll plug these all in together, so they're all on one chain. Once I've done that, what you'll see is this breakout cable basically puts them all into a single actual fan header. Now this is nice because what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this in to my CPU fan. So basically what that means is that the motherboard itself, as the temperatures rise on your CPU, it will be able to spin all of these fans together at once. So if everything's chill and quiet, the fans are running at idle, no big deal. However, once you really start stressing the CPU and your temperatures come up, the motherboard can just volt up all 3 of the fans at the same time. So it's nice. And importantly, all of this nonsense we're just gonna tuck in the back so you can't see. Now before I do tuck all that in the back, let me also do the same thing for my RGB. So this is the same kind of deal. So all 3 of these are gonna go into this little dongle here. So when it comes to RGB, it's a little bit complicated. Surprise, surprise, right? So every different type of RGB you have is gonna, first of all, need a different piece of software. So whether it's ReSURGEance Chroma or AuraSync from ASUS or whatever the case is. But also they all connect slightly differently. So for example, with this sort of set of RGB fans here, we have 3 of these 5-volt connectors. So thankfully we do have a little breakout cable, so we can just plug them all in together and they will go into our motherboard. However, there are different standards for RGB And sometimes you're gonna need a whole hub, sometimes you can plug directly into the motherboard, sometimes you plug into a hub, which then plugs into the motherboard. As always, it's good to double check your manual to make sure that you're doing it correctly. It's fine once you get it set up, it'll look great, but I'll tell you that it is always a fiddly mess. Something like our Lee fans is gonna be a little bit simpler because this all just goes into a hub, so you don't really have to worry about it too much. But for this, I'm gonna go ahead and put all these on the breakout cable as I have with my fans. So you can see, even though this looks like a complete mess right now, all of this is gonna just go into 2 different ports on the motherboard. So once we've got all these connected, we'll deal with it later. We can go ahead and mount up the actual radiator. But it's good to do this before you've got everything locked in so you have a little bit more flexibility. So to install the radiator, it's very simple. So just like with a regular fan, we're gonna use the smaller screws. We're gonna get one started on the top. Doesn't have to be lined up. In fact, it's probably not gonna be lined up because you've got to do this with 2 hands. We're just gonna do it tight enough so that the radiator doesn't fall down. And even though I'm installing this on the sort of back part of our case, this would be the same process if we were gonna do it on the top. The only difference is oftentimes when you're mounting it on the top of your case, it'll actually have a little bracket that will come out. Obviously, with this, there is no bracket, but we have this little magnetic door that sort of gets out of our way. And again, like we keep talking about for this tutorial, we're gonna do it in a cross pattern. So we've got the top right end, so we do the bottom left now. Because I didn't do it too tight, I can still adjust it up and down a little bit. So I'm gonna give it just a little bit of space on the bottom. Now, don't do it super tight here, because we're not gonna lock it in until we know that it's actually straight. So if we look at it from the front, it actually looks pretty good. Because it's a little loose, I can kind of slide up and down. And again, I like to leave just a little bit of space on the bottom before I actually start tightening it down for real. So I can run a cable down there. So I'm actually going to go ahead and tighten this screw. So we'll do it right about here. And then from this point, once you've got your radiator mostly in position, you'll just go back through. You should use all the screws. I might use 4 instead of the 12 that they give you. You just wanna make sure that your radiator is nicely and firmly sort of planted into your case. Lovely, so our AIO is physically installed now. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take all this mess of cables, I'm gonna pull it around the back. We're gonna run them back forward once we're actually ready to plug it in, but I just wanna start by running everything out the back so we don't have to worry about it. Now there's definitely a school of thought, which is when you're building a PC, don't care about cable management. I don't subscribe to that school of thought. Good Lord, hang on, I got it. Ow! It's not a real PC build until you've bled for the cause. So with all of my cables roughly run in position, now it is time to start plugging things in. So we're gonna start with the pump. So the pump has a 4-pin, which this is actually going to be powered for the pump itself. If you look on the top here, it will actually say pump fan, so it's pretty straightforward. And this one's already zip tied. I'm actually gonna kind of leave that alone for now. So we're gonna plug that into the pump fan header. We're also going to, if we pull, actually I've already pulled it all the way through. There's a USB header on the bottom of our pump. Again, very standard. I've got it already run down here. This is a normal USB 2.0. So just the same way we plugged in the other one. It's got that 1 pin knocked out. Ow, I hit the door with my foot.
There's a door there.
All right, and we'll plug that in too. So basically we've got, this one is for the actual pump header, and this one is for the Lee little dingle dongle. Now, if you look in the back here, you'll see that we've still got a big old mess of cables. So what I need to do is I need to plug this cable. So this is our 5-volt RGB. I need to plug this into the motherboard. Now, on this board, I do have a couple of slots, so I actually think I'm gonna plug it into the bottom here. So there's one right there. So I'm just gonna route this down, since if anything, I have plenty of space for this. So I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna route it through here. And at this point, it is, I hate to say it, but pretty straightforward. So I'm gonna just plug in my fans. So it's the same deal. You rinse and repeat for however many fans you have and however many RGB controllers you have. If you do not have enough ports on your motherboard for all of your various RGB accessories, you may need a hub. It completely depends on what brand you're using, how many RGB devices, if you're running light strips, yada, yada, yada. But generally speaking, with a nice board like this, we do have at least a couple of RGB spots. So I think that will be enough for me, but I'll plug it all in and we'll see how it actually goes. Next up, we're going to be installing our hard drive. So both this as well as a 2.5-inch SSD, they install pretty much the same way. So they use the same connectors on the bottom. So you've got SATA power as well as SATA data. So I'll show that in just a second. Now, obviously, a lot of systems aren't gonna use a physical hard drive, but I still find that there's a lot of value in a big, high-capacity hard drive for all kinds of random bits and bobs. So this is the cage. So this actually just came out the back right here. So this is the one that didn't fall out accidentally. This is the one I actually pulled out. And the way to install is pretty straightforward. When we look at the hard drive, you'll see you have your SATA power, which is the longer connector here, and the SATA data, which is the smaller one here. So these are going to plug into your motherboard and power supply respectively. When you look on the bottom, you'll see that there are a bunch of little screw holes. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, as well as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Based on the type of bracket, you're gonna either install it on the bottom or on the side. So for this one, if I line this up here, making sure that the ports are facing out so that I can actually plug them in, it actually lines up with the grommets and the holes that are already attached on the bottom. You can screw it in on the side, on the bottom, whatever's easier. For this, it doesn't actually give me the option of doing it on the side, totally fine. So what I'm gonna do, I've already pulled out 4 of my screws. I'll say that normally you're gonna wanna use all the screws for a hard drive because this is a physically spinning mechanism. You don't want it to be rattling around. And you'll see that this drive caddy already has rubber grommets. So basically that little bits of vibration shouldn't be sort of transferred to the rest of your system. All right, so go ahead and tighten that up. So it's 1. All right. So I'm gonna line this up here. As always, just get started with 1. It'll kind of hold things in position. You don't have to do it super tight. With this, it's really hard to see the holes there. It's very dark. Once you've got 2 screws in, the rest of them should be easy. Now, as I do this, I will also show you how to do a 2.5-inch SSD. So technically you can get an adapter. So if you only have 3.5-inch drive bays, which would be weird, but if that works better for your case, you can just install a 2.5 in this, so it'll actually use those inner holes. But what you'll see here is that you have all these little holes here. So there's 1, 2, and 3 sets. So if I was going to install a 2.5-inch SSD, it would be the exact same process. I would just use the holes here and just line it up. So what you'll see is that those all come through. You would just slide over to the side, so we'll actually take a nice sort of solid connection. And then what you would do is you would just run your cables around and inside. You can see that these 2.5-inch drives are very thin, so you can kind of tuck them in a lot of different areas. Some cases will have them on the back panel. You could actually technically even install them right here. So you'll see that they've got the little sort of panels. And if I'm being very honest with you, while I wouldn't just chuck a hard drive in, if you've got a little SSD, you can kind of just put it inside. It's fine. Maybe on occasions I just plugged it in and went.
At least tell them to use double-sided tape, my dude.
The only extra piece of advice I will give you is that when you're installing your hard drive, actually do the screws relatively tight. Because you're going into the rubber, you're gonna have a lot of play with it, but that is just going to mean that it's gonna be nice and secure. So again, those vibrations are kept away from your hard drive and your PC. Now with our hard drive installed, what we'll do is we'll just line that up with the back of our case. So our hard drive is physically installed. Next up, we need to connect it. So there's only 2 cables we're looking for. So first we're gonna go to our power supply. Actually, this would be a good time for me to explain a couple of our cables that we haven't used yet. So we've got SATA here, but actually let me show you Molex really quick. We're not using this for this build, but I just want to explain this is what a Molex connector looks like. It's much more meant for legacy cables. So think some like older RGB hubs and fans and stuff may use this. Largely it's meant for like really old stuff. Like we're talking like ancient hard drives, like floppy disks, that kind of stuff. I would say the vast majority of systems don't need Molex. I'm actually gonna unplug this modular cable just to give myself a little bit of space here. But if you do have, especially like a fan hub or something like that that has this derpy looking Molex connector, it just snaps directly in. It's pretty straightforward.
I have 2 components that use Molex.
Like what?
One of them is a PCI USB 3 card, and it gives power.
12 years old, got it.
And my Wi-Fi Bluetooth card.
That needs Molex?
For power.
So Matt has some ancient components that have not been touched since the year 2000.
It's Wi-Fi 6!
What we will need though is SATA. So let me show you. So this is a little lead. So you see from the power supply, we have 4 SATA ports. So what you'll see if you look closely, there's a notch on one side. So this sort of long skinny connector, and it sort of like notches down on the end. So as always, going to mean it only goes in one way. Now SATA, while it's not ultra common, you don't need this on every single system. You're probably gonna need it for the most part. So now we're going to need this to power our hard drive, but we also need to power our fan hub. So that is where a lot of sort of RGB accessories and whatnot and fans, they're gonna use SATA for power. Sometimes you can plug them directly into the motherboard. Sometimes you have to do both. Generally speaking, if there's a SATA connector that is needed on your hub, then you better plug it in. Otherwise, it's not gonna work. So if I pull that out here, you'll see that I actually have 2, which, you know what, because Lee and Lee are overachievers, I'm gonna need to plug both of them in.
What I like to do is, because you've got 4 on here, I like to do on the sort of the closer end ones, so the ones that are closest to the power supply. And what that means is that we can take the very end of the SATA cable and plug it into the hard drive, just so you have the maximum amount of room, so I can kind of tuck this down to the bottom. When it comes to plugging this in, all you gotta do is line it up. It's only gonna go in one way. There will be no click, but you'll see it's nice and seated. So that's 1. And we will do 1 more here, put all the way in. Cool, and now we still have 2 more, and I'm going to wrap this top one in, and I'm gonna plug it in right here. It's a little hard to see, and again, it's not gonna click. We push it into place. It's gonna be nice and seated. Cool, power is good. Next, let's do SATA data. So remember earlier when I was telling you there's all kind of cables that come with your motherboard and don't toss them? Well, this is the point where I need to figure out where I tossed them, because I don't know where I put it. So you'll see that we have 2 SATA cables that are included in the motherboard. Now, the only thing to note with these, they're going to also be notched, so they're only going to go in one way, but usually you're gonna get 2 different kinds. So you'll see this is a straight cable, so they'll go in directly straight. This also comes with an angled cable. So depending on how your hard drive is set up, sometimes that angled cable is nice. You can kind of like tuck it and sort of get a nice little bend on it. Doesn't matter. For this case, I think I can use either. What I will do though, is think a little bit about how I'm gonna plug this in. So it's gonna plug in directly to my port here. So I'm gonna use a straight cable here, plug it in, and this will click, and then I'm gonna route that through the back. And again, trying to have some semblance of cable management. And now once we made it all the way to our hard drive, what we'll do is we'll plug it in. Now it does have a little metal connector on it, so when it goes in, you're gonna hear the click, and because it has a notch, it is only gonna go in one way. Remember, the data cables are the skinnier ones, the power cables are the longer ones. So I'm gonna just route this right here until I hear and boom! There we go, our hard drive is installed, or our SSD, or in this case, our hard drive as well as our fan hub. So at this point, my friends, we're actually looking pretty good. While the back is still a little bit of a mess, that's fine. But if we rotate around to the front, let's just kind of take a quick look at where we're at. So we have CPU, we have cooler, RAM, SSD, hard drive, all of our fans installed. All that's really left at this point is to install our hardware named the graphics card.
Sure.
I caught myself.
You can also just redo the line.
I could also just commit to the fact that I saved it, and I'm really proud of the fact that I saved it. Alrighty, my friends, it's time for the main event, our RTX 5080. So installing almost any graphics card is the same process, except for these more recent NVIDIA cards, which use a different power connector. I'll explain that in a second. The only other thing to consider is just the physical size, right? Every graphics card at its core is gonna go into our PCI slot right here. However, certain cards are larger than others. A normal Intel or an AMD or a lower end NVIDIA card, they're pretty straightforward. You'll just plug it in, no big deal, super simple. However, a lot of graphics cards, such as this 5080, are large, which gives you a different thing to consider. Sometimes when you put one of these GPU in, it's so big that it actually sags. So we're gonna take a look at this one, but that just means that you have to have a little bit of extra thought around how you're gonna support the graphics card. Remember I said that whole like why this is metal? Yeah, because these graphics cards are friggin' enormous. 8, 9, 10 years ago, graphics cards were much smaller and it was much simpler to install them, but nowadays you actually have to think about, is your graphics card so big that it's going to sag? Not only it's gonna look ugly, but that actually can cause damage. Here we go, my friends. This is our, oh, it's very tight. Wow, it's impressively tight. All right, my friends, here is our absolute chungus of a graphics card. And oh, good Lord, this...
Jeez, you can kill somebody with that thing.
Brother, what the hell are we looking at here? Okay, so as an RTX 5080, this is one of the most powerful graphics cards you can get. So do you see this right here? This is our PCI bracket. This is the size of a normal graphics card. This is all extra. This is gonna go a little something like that. It will fit, it definitely will fit, but also we're not gonna have a huge amount of space. So you see why I was telling you to run all these cables ahead of time? Technically, you can do the cables at the end. I used to tell you to do the cables at the very end until graphics cards got so big that you can't see or reach anything underneath it. So while, again, don't do a whole lot of cable management, that's fine.
But if you see any cables that you might want to like move around a little bit, do it maybe now versus later, because otherwise it is going to be very difficult to work around this enormous beast of a GPU. So the only thing I need to do before I install this is take out our PCI covers around the back. Even though this is huge and enormous, it only requires us to take out 2. So if you line it up, usually you're going to pick your second and your third slot. So see here that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individual PCI slot covers. The first one is pretty much always for your SSD. So if you look on the board, you'll see that this is slot number 2 technically. So if I line this up, what you'll see is that we need to take out slot number 2, as well as slot number 3. I really hope that there's a GPU support in this box, because this thing is, I think, maybe the largest GPU I've ever built with. So I'm gonna unscrew these 2 screws and remove these guys. Hold on to these, you'll use these later, but we will be using these screws immediately after to install our GPU. Now there's a whole bunch of film on this guy, absolutely everywhere, as well as a bunch of port covers actually. Wow, there's a lot. They really wanna keep this protected, hang on. So, remove the bottom cover. There are also port covers on the back of the GPU, which we will be removing. You just take all these off, honestly, it's fine. And then, begin the peel, my friends. Lord, this is so much. This is. You know what, all that stuff I was saying earlier about, oh, you gotta be careful when you pick cases. This is the kind of card you need to be careful of. It is so unbelievably huge that a lot of normal cases just simply wouldn't fit it. Uh-oh, what do we have here? Yeah, okay, oh, interesting. So before we install our SSD, we thankfully do have a little support, which I'm not sure is gonna be massively useful, to be honest, but we'll take a look at that in a second. So when it comes to powering your graphics card, there are 2 different ways you can connect things. So if you're using an AMD, an Intel, or an older NVIDIA GPU, you will be using our 6+2 pin connectors. These have been around for a very long time, so you can see there's a 6, or if you want to, you can put them together. Most of the time you're gonna use it together as an 8 pin. This works great. If your graphics card has this, no problem at all. However, if you're using an RTX 40 or RTX 50 series, then instead, you're going to be needing one of these little guys. So this is a 16 pin power connector. It looks like it's 12, but there's also 4 additional pins on the bottom. This is a newer, sleeker cable that will provide a ton of power. So if you look at the actual GPU, so all GPUs as of right now still ship with the adapters in the box. So you'll see that this little sleek connector has 3 of the 8 pins that all go into it. The thing you need to consider is that this connector is clean and simple and smooth when it comes to installing it, and it looks great and it's very straightforward. You wanna make sure this thing is fully seated into your graphics card. In fact, you'll see that while you can use the adapter, I don't really recommend these because it's kind of nice to have a newer power supply that has it built in. You can use this. I like the idea of using the cables that have been specially designed so you don't have to worry about any adapters. The reason why this is yellow and the newer 16-pin cables have been shipping or yellow or red or something is because you want to make sure that when you plug this in, you don't see any of the yellow connector, right? You want to make sure it's fully seated, because otherwise this connector and these cables can actually melt, which could cause serious damage, as you might expect, to your graphics card, to your cable, to your power supply, to your PC. And I will generally recommend, if you are using one of these newer graphics cards, especially something like a 5080, you may actually want to just buy a new power supply. All right, now let us install the beast. I'll say, this is a really silly recommendation, you might need a friend for this one. I say that because this thing's heavy, right? So watch, as I go to install it, you'll see that normally what you'll do is on the bottom here, this is our PCI Express connector, right? So that is all graphics cards are going to use this. That is going to interface into the slot on your motherboard. Now, normally you can just plug it in. Oh, there's more plastic, good lord. So I'm going to do this by myself, and I'm just going to try to get my screws ready. This is not a problem for almost any system except for one with a huge GPU. Basically, you're gonna, once you install it, you're gonna use the 2 screws to mount it, the same screws that we just removed from these covers. But because it's such a big and heavy GPU, I'm actually not gonna take my hand off of it because that's a lot of weight it's gonna be pulling down. It's fine, but I'm gonna be a little careful anyway. I'm gonna line it up here, making sure that our connector is as close to seat as possible. A little wiggle, and then we're gonna click it and it should go all the way into place. Now, without letting go of the GPU, I'm gonna keep holding it here. I'm going to use my thumb screw.
Do you need help?
No, I'm showing you how to do it by yourself. Look, I don't have to hold it, but I don't want it to collapse. So it's just a big heavy boy.
Do you want to use the little?
No, I'm fine. I can do it by myself. Okay, so see, we're gonna at least I can get one of these screws in pretty tight to take off some of the pressure. There we go. Now I can let go. We want to put both screws in for sure. But now we have our absolute chungus of a GPU installed. Good Lord, this thing is just, and this is not even a 5090, right? This is a 5080. Not that that makes it that much cheaper or anything, but like, I mean, this is high-end stuff. And there's even more plastic too. Look at this. It actually, I will say, for as big as it is, it's actually not sagging too badly. So what sag is essentially, you'll see that on this side, you see as it goes farther away, it's being held in on this side on the top. So like, it actually should be up here, and just kind of the weight of it's kind of pulling it down. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to, oh boy, this is actually too big. Uh-oh, I don't think this is, no, that's not gonna work.
Can you do it behind the fan?
I might be able to, yeah. So this is a little, basically just a little riser. So basically what you'll do is if you, oh, what? Does it not adjust? Oh, it does adjust out, oh, okay. Oh, that's a little screwdriver inside, that's cute. So basically what you would do is you would adjust this up and down to the right height. Use the thumb screw to hold it. Yeah, I think I can get it back here. Yeah, and it's magnetized as well. Yes, I can get it back there. Oh, I think I got it. Oh, does it fit? Yeah, boy, perfect. That actually looks really neat. So now we have a support, and you can see it's all the way in the back here. So if I push on the GPU, it's pushing directly down. I might want to give it a little bit more. Actually, no, that's pretty level, right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
I'll give it just a little bit more. Now this is all about just making sure our PC stays healthy over the long term and nothing gets ripped out. So there we go, look at that. You could eat lunch on that bad boy. Don't do that though. Our GPU is firmly installed, so we have our 2 screws for the actual PCI covers. Obviously it's plugged in directly to the motherboard, and we do have our support hidden around the back. The last thing we need to do is plug it into power. So like I said earlier, if you were gonna use this adapter, you could, but it's ugly and silly looking. So instead we're gonna take our 16-pin connector and we're gonna run it through the back. So we're gonna need it to end here, which would mean it's gonna be a little bit of an ugly run. And we're gonna run it straight through here. As always, I'm just gonna run as close to the connector as possible. It's not gonna look great, but whatever. So just gonna get in that right spot. Now, the actual power for the GPU is usually in the middle on most builds these days, but it varies. Sometimes it's on the back, sometimes it's around the side, or whatever the case is. Largely it's here, which is a little bit unfortunate because it's a little ugly to actually run the cable. Sometimes you actually can run the cable underneath, which I could do, but I think I'd rather run it on the top just for a little bit of a cleaner look. Now, this 16-pin connector is gonna plug in the same way as like an 8-pin would. There's a little clip, so it's only gonna go in one way. But again, with an 8-pin or a 6+2 or whatever, when you're plugging a normal GPU, you plug it in, it just works, right? It's pretty straightforward. This one, because it's so much smaller and there's a lot more pins, you have to put a little bit more pressure in. But that's why we screwed it in, we've put the whole support on it. This GPU's not going anywhere. If I push it in with some force, it should be fine. So you can see that it's not plugged in all the way, so I see yellow. I do not want to see yellow. So I'm going to forcefully push it in. So that feels like it's in, right? It's not in. I still see yellow. Keep pushing. There we go. Now I see absolutely no yellow. Look on top and bottom. That is fully seated. So I'll just tuck the rest of that cable out of the way. Like I said, it's always gonna be a little ugly. I don't think there's really a way to get that much cleaner unless we wanted to run it around the bottom. My friends, I have exciting news. That was the last step. Well, if you don't count putting your case back together and doing cable management, but we'll do that later. This is a great time to do a little idiot check. Did you remember to plug in your CPU power, your 20+4 pin? Do you have all of your fans connected? Do you have anything that looks obviously wrong? Just take a little look around to make sure. No big deal, it's the perfect time to sort of find anything that you're missing. But I usually just like to make sure that stuff like the 20+4 CPU, we have our GPU plugged in, we're all looking like nothing is dangling or nothing is obviously missing. This all looks good to me. If so, it's time to proceed to my favorite part of any PC build. Plugging it in, press the power button, and hoping real well that it's gonna work. It might not, in which case we'll go to troubleshooting mode, but I feel like we'll be just fine. I'm gonna unplug all these power supply cables I had for the tutorial that I'm not using, because they're ugly and stupid. All right, my friends, the time is here. Before you decide to plug your PC in and actually give it the first boot, make sure you have a mouse and keyboard, definitely at least the keyboard. Make sure you have your monitor, and importantly, plug your monitor into the graphics card. So even though you do have DisplayPort and HDMI on this motherboard, that would be going to the internal graphics, which you don't want to do. You actually want to plug that directly into your graphics card. All right, the moment is here. Let's push the power button and see what happens. That is an excellent sign when all of your RGB immediately lights up. Dude, this thing's gonna look sick. I like to check all the fans that are spinning. GPU fans will usually spin and they'll spin down after a second. All of our RGB is RGBing. Now this is gonna take a second. Don't worry. Oh, well, that's immediately a good sign the monitor's starting to see something. USB is coming up, so our keyboard's turning on. So sometimes this first boot can take a couple minutes. Don't stress, don't mess with it. You may even see it turn on and off a time, maybe 2. That's all good. Just be patient. If it takes more than like 3 or 4 minutes, that's where we're gonna have problems. But it's gonna do its initial boot, make sure everything's coming online. Hey, and there we go. So we've got ourselves Ryzen 7 9800X 3D processor. Oh, it's already in. Okay, well, I didn't get to read it. But this is an excellent, excellent sign. The last thing you wanna do before you continue on is just to make sure that everything is actually showing up. So, CPU, Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, perfect. 32 gigs of RAM, perfect. If you look over here, we're gonna see storage. It does see our 990 EVO, as well as 990 EVO Plus, as well as it does see our 2 terabyte hard drive. All right, my friends, now it is time to celebrate because you have successfully built yourself a gaming PC. However, we're not done yet. Even though the physical PC is ready, we still need to do some cable management, and before we do that, there's a couple things we want to do here in the BIOS. So if you're unfamiliar, the BIOS is before you have any operating system installed. So you'll see here, we can do a lot of tweaking and tuning of various different settings. So I'm going to show you a couple of these. And once we've done that, then we're going to install Windows, and I'll walk you through the whole process of getting an operating system on here, getting your driver set up, all that kind of fun stuff. So we're done, but we're not quite done yet. So looking at our BIOS, a few things you want to do right off the top. So depending on whether you're using AMD or Intel, you're going to want to run your memory at whatever speed it's rated for. So for example, with this, I have Expo. Now, if you're using Intel, you'll be using an XMP profile. All that's going to do is it's going to set the memory to the speeds that it is designed for. The main other thing you want to do while you're in here is to turn on resizable bar. Now this should be on by default. This is going to, for any modern graphics card, give you a decent step up in performance. So MSI, I think it's a little complicated. So we're going to go to Advanced, go to Settings, and go to Advanced again, PCI subsystem settings, and yes, you'll see that resizable bar support is on. Again, that's gonna be on for the vast majority of newer motherboards. Now, the only other thing you could do, you don't always have to do it, but you could also update your BIOS. Generally speaking, I do recommend updating your BIOS every little while, maybe every like 2 or 3 months. It's a little bit of a process because essentially you have to grab a USB stick, you have to load the actual BIOS file from the manufacturer's website, and then for the example with this build, you would plug it in via USB and hit M-Flash, and then it would find that new BIOS and update it. But the thing is, it's different with every manufacturer, and you don't really need to do it. But the nice thing is, newer BIOSes can improve things like performance, security, and especially with AMD motherboards, you actually can get support for future CPUs. So sometimes this motherboard might work with the next generation or even the generation after that. You don't know, but if you get a BIOS update, it actually may allow you to do that. All that information will be on the actual motherboard manufacturer's website. For now, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna go ahead and just save all these settings. F10, hit yes, and then it should reboot. And as soon as we see the BIOS show up one more time, we're gonna make sure all these settings stuck. It is time to install Windows. If you wanna install Linux, you're on your own. Nerds. That's the guy with the nerd emoji glasses right now.
What about Mac OS?
You clicked on the wrong video for that one. I'm just gonna wait one moment just to make sure that all of our settings saved. Oh yeah, fun little fact. If you ever do update your BIOS, usually you have to go back through and do what I just did. So when you update, normally it does forget all your normal settings. So you now can see that our RAM is set to 6,000 megatransfers per second. Just a little pro tip, when you update your BIOS, make sure to go and re-enable things like your Expo or your XMP profile. Other than that, it should be pretty straightforward. Before we begin installing software, the next step is to do just a little bit of cable management and finish buttoning up our PC. Now, you can go as in-depth as you like with this. I'm gonna give you a quick primer on things. The most important thing, as I was saying as we were building, is just trying to be a little bit sort of careful when it comes to running your cables. So for example, right now, this is a little bit of a mess, but it's actually not too bad. I've already run something like my 20+4 pin through the cable channel, and a lot of these things are actually not too crazy. Importantly, they're all in roughly the right spot. I'll probably end up tucking my GPU power connector through this cable channel. All of these SATAs can be bundled up and tucked in. But the good thing is with a case like this, I have a lot of depth. Like there's a lot of space, especially with that extra hard drive sort of removed. So this is the next step, really just make sure that you're cleaning things up. Before you do that though, make sure to unplug your power supply. Just don't mess with your computer when the power's connected to it. Even though I do that sometimes. Shh.
Don't tell them that you do that.
I'm a firm believer of do as I say, not as I do. Also, before I forget, If your motherboard has Wi-Fi, you're gonna have a couple of antennas that are inside the motherboard box. Now it's a great time to connect these to the back of your motherboard so your Wi-Fi is good. Because technically you actually will see Wi-Fi networks without the antennas, except it would just be really terrible. The next step is to install Windows. Now if you purchase a physical version of Windows from your friendly local Micro Center, it will come on a little USB stick, as well as it will have your actual key to activate Windows. However, if you want to use a key that you maybe already have, you can actually create your own USB to do this very simply. So on a Windows PC, all you need to do is check out the Microsoft Media Creation tool. It will download a copy of Windows 11, format your USB. I believe it needs to be 32 gigs. Is it 32? Actually, let me double check. They say it only needs to be 8 gigs. Oh, that's pretty good. You only need an 8 gig USB. I have a 128 here. Once you've created or bought your USB, the next step is to install it. So we're going to, with our computer off, plug the USB into our motherboard. Now, normally when you fire up the system, it'll actually immediately boot from that USB. However, sometimes that doesn't happen, so I'll show you what to do with that. So I'm going to press the power button, and immediately I'm going to start spamming the delete key on my keyboard. So this should force us into the BIOS, and that way we can choose to boot from whatever media we want. Just keep spamming, keep spamming. At some point, it'll work. Also, just fun fact, this is also how to get in the BIOS. It's taking a second, isn't it? There we go. Cool. It took a second, but that's all good. So what you'll see here is that you can see your boot priorities. So by default, it will want to boot off of your SSD or your hard drive. But in this case, we actually want to boot from our USB. So from that case, I can go ahead and just hit F10. Go ahead and let it actually boot properly. So now our system should be booting from our Windows installation media. Now, I will say that on modern PCs, Windows is actually pretty fast to install. It used to take absolutely forever back in the day. But I mean, on a system like this, it might only take us like, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes to actually set up. So let me go ahead and wait for it to actually come online. So now we should begin to see, yep, there we go, our Windows 11 setup. Now I'll walk you through this. It is very simple and very straightforward. You choose your language as well as your time and currency. Now I am going to install Windows 11. So I do agree that everything will be deleted. Now this is a completely brand new SSD. There is nothing to wipe. Now it's gonna ask for my product key. I'm gonna install that later because I don't have it with me right now. Now it's going to ask you to connect to the internet. Nothing wrong with that. If you're able to, you can connect via Ethernet or Wi-Fi, and you'll be able to log into your friendly Microsoft account. However, every once in a while, that doesn't work. I'll show you how to work around that. But let me just go through the normal process here. So I want to install Windows 11 Home, which is the operating system that you're probably going to use. I agree to all the terms and conditions. There's many of them. Now comes something that I have set up for myself that looks very confusing. If you have set up your computer with a single drive, single SSD, then it will show up here as disk number 0. However, I, in my infinite wisdom, have decided to outfit my system with two 2 terabyte drives, one SSD, one hard drive. Can I tell which one's which? Nope, not really. It shows one 1.8 terabyte drive, and two 1.8 terabyte drives. I am pretty sure that disk 0 would be my SSD. Am I sure about that? Nope, I'm not. Is this a problem for anyone besides me who has decided to use two identically sized drives when I am setting up my system? Nope. And if I'm wrong, I'm gonna have to reinstall all my SSD. So wish me luck. Actually, you know what? Here's the real pro tip. If you wanna make sure you're not a big dummy like me and accidentally connect two exactly the same size drives, for the Windows installation part, unplug your hard drive. Just pull out the SATA power, the SATA data, whatever is easiest. Install Windows on your known SSD, and then once you're fully up into Windows, shut your system down, plug your hard drive back in, and you can do that. Once you've selected the correct drive, click Next. It will begin to format that drive, make sure everything is set up correctly. It should take just a second, and then it will allow us to continue. Yes, I am ready to install Windows 11. It is now going to begin to install. And the fact that it is going so fast, I'm pretty sure I have selected the SSD. So give me a few minutes to let this run, do its initial sort of installs, and I'll continue walking you through the next steps. All right, after successfully installing Windows on the SSD and not the hard drive, we are going to continue our setup. So this is all very straightforward, but I will walk you through it. This is gonna be the point normally where it's gonna ask me to connect to the internet. There we go. Let's connect you to a network. So, do you notice this? It is asking me to connect to Ethernet. Obviously, I don't have that. I do have Wi-Fi, but it doesn't see it. It will now, however, give me the option to install a driver, which is nice. Or I can say I don't have internet. And I think, well, let me go. Oh, look at that. It actually let me go. That might not always be a thing. Let me show you how to do it if it doesn't work. If you do not have the ability to connect your computer to the internet for this initial setup, let me show you a little workaround. So you press Shift and F10. it'll pop up your command prompt. Type in OOBE / bypass NRO. Once it restarts, it will then allow you to install Windows offline, at which point you can actually grab a USB, install your drivers, get everything up and running. Thankfully, they've actually made some changes, so sometimes they're not super grumpy about you not having an internet to begin with, but a lot of times, especially with regular Windows 11 Home, you'll have to do this. So now we're restarting. It's gonna look exactly the same as it was before, except it should allow us to just breeze right past the internet connection screen. All right, so I'm gonna don't have internet, and now it is going to let me connect a offline account. So I'm just gonna say Austin. My password is butts. Security questions are all my security questions. Now, it's gonna ask me for some privacy settings. You can choose to do whatever you like with these. You could maybe click on each and every one of them and hit nope, 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 nope. Or you could leave them on, or you could just hit nope, 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 nope. And then it's gonna install some more stuff in the background. And theoretically, once it's done with this screen, we will be presented with the beautiful Windows 11 desktop, which my first step will be to put the XP Bliss background on. Might take a few minutes. Don't turn off your PC. Ta-da! We are now into Windows. So the very first thing I like to do once we've landed is right-click on my taskbar, tap Task Manager, and then we're gonna double check all our specs are actually being shown correctly. So we see our Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, lovely. We see our 32 gigs of RAM at 6,000 mega transfers per second, lovely. We see our SSD showing up correctly. Where's the hard drive? I unplugged it, because I accidentally installed it to the hard drive the first time. I'm gonna plug that back in a minute. And we also see our removable disk, which is our USB, which is a perfect time to remember to unplug. From this point, it is time to move back over to my laptop or another Windows PC of some variety, because it's now time to start loading up drivers. Now, if your computer will connect to the internet right off the gate, that's super easy, because then you can just plug in Ethernet or connect to Wi-Fi, and you can download drivers on that. But like I said, a lot of times the drivers won't work out of the box, so it's nice to have a separate computer to actually download a lot of this stuff on. If you'd like, you can actually just reuse the exact same USB you just did, or if you want to, you can just keep one around that has like your Windows 11 on it. It doesn't really matter. I'm gonna use a brand new USB and connect it to my laptop. So my first step is to go to the motherboard's manufacturer website. I'm going to look up my specific board, which in this case is an X670E Tomahawk. Now this is gonna give us a bunch of options, so we're gonna make sure this is our 670E, which that is correct. And then you wanna go to support. Now there are gonna be a whole bunch of drivers on here, including your BIOS, so this would be a great time to see that, look, there's a new BIOS that is one generation newer than I put on. Good time to do that. Although if you're gonna update your BIOS, do it on a separate USB because you have to format the whole thing. For your drivers, you can just load it up into anything like exFAT formatted or something. There's a couple ways you can do this. You can download each and every one of your individual drivers, which is what I normally do. However, if you go to the utilities section, normally there's something like this, which is MSI Center, which is gonna include a bunch of your stuff. Sometimes motherboards will give you some extra junk that you don't need. So maybe I'm just gonna do my normal driver. So things I want my chipset driver. So yes, please download. Onboard VGA is nice to have, especially if you ever want to disconnect your actual graphics card for whatever reason. Same thing with our LAN drivers. So that's gonna be Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, as well as Ethernet. Audio drivers, as well as SATA drivers, right? So you're gonna wanna download all of these, load them up on your flash drive, and then hop them over to your PC. With our driver USB on our system, I've copied over all of our various different drivers and unzipped them. So there's a bunch, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that I pulled from the MSI site. With each and every one, literally just go through, click the setup, hit yes, let it do its thing, including this Windows XP looking install shield wizard. And once you've done all of this, you will want to restart your system. So this should be our last one, which is our Ethernet. Once it is done installing and we restart, things such as your Wi-Fi, your Ethernet, all of the bits and bobs should then be up and running. And once you can get this online, then we can proceed. But as long as you've just got those main core drivers to actually get you online, that's the most important thing. Oh, I just realized, Windows installed a graphics driver for the 5080. I didn't have to touch it. You know, I will say the Windows 11 installers have actually gotten better. Normally, you're like freaking like 1024 by 768 and it's all squished until you install your graphics driver. It actually has one by default. All of our drivers are now installed, or at least all of the ones we got from the MSI website. And once we restart, we'll relog back into Windows. Again, you can go ahead and take out your driver USB. And then we can now proceed to install our graphics drivers. So depending on what kind of graphics card you have is which drivers you're gonna look for. So obviously if you're looking for Intel, you're gonna look for Intel Arc drivers. If you're using an AMD card, you wanna download the latest AMD card drivers from the site. And because we're using an RTX 5080, we're gonna go to the NVIDIA site and then select our RTX 5080 goodness, expensiveness. Also another way to phrase that. Alrighty, now, theoretically, we'll see, yes, Wi-Fi has now materialized. So I'm gonna go ahead and connect to our Wi-Fi. Once your computer goes online, it's probably gonna have a whole lot of things going on. First of all, for this computer, I actually am gonna need to change the date. So it thinks it's April 1st, 2024. So what I will do here, I just right-clicked on the time and pulled up the time and date. So I'm going to have it sync now. So if I click that, it should automatically pull up. Yep, February 11th, that's all fine. Now, one thing we will want to do as well is do Windows Update. But before you do Windows Update, I actually like to download my graphics driver. Mostly because sometimes when you do Windows Update, it will pull like an NVIDIA driver, but it's like an older one. The official NVIDIA drivers, and then what you want to do is you will want to just download your specific driver. So I'm going to pick probably category just GeForce. Oh, or I can also just press the Game Ready one. I think I hear Windows Update running. Do you hear my fans dramatically ramping up? Yeah, that's another thing. What you can do is once you get everything set up, you can actually tweak your fan curves, not only through your motherboard, so you're actually doing it through the BIOS, but there are also different utilities. So I'm gonna show you like the basic version of this, which is to download your core things, right? You need your graphics driver, you need your Ethernet drivers, all that kind of stuff. There are a bunch of other things you may want to install, right? So for example, you may want Razer Chroma, you may want MSI Control Center, you may want ASUS AuraSync. There's a lot of things that's very much going to depend on the hardware that you've got. That's also the utilities, these are the ones that you would be using to control your RGB. So if I want to turn it out of my Rainbow Parade mode to like, I don't know, all white, which is what I normally do anyway. I guess at this point I would install not only the drivers from Lee, but I would also install the ROG drivers. Gonna install my graphics driver. The good thing is graphics drivers these days actually don't usually need you to restart. And then theoretically, our GPU will be up and running. Now, it will ask you for NVIDIA specifically if I want the NVIDIA app. I actually will say yes. It's actually kind of helpful. It will go ahead and remove whatever driver that Windows has, and it will give us some beautiful RTX goodness. Now, while this is running, it's not a good idea to do anything, but you may want to get some Windows updates going because depending on how old your USB is, it may have a couple updates it needs, it may have a whole bunch. But try not to do a whole lot of stuff while the graphics drivers are installing. I feel like this is old school advice because I feel like it's totally fine now, but I was always raised, every installer would say, don't touch anything, close all other programs, only install this thing. I'm like, yes, sir. My single core 120 megabytes of RAM agrees. That wasn't that long ago. 25 years? Oh my God. So at this point, it's gonna ask if we wanna launch the NVIDIA app. I don't feel like doing that. So we're actually in pretty good shape now. Now to double check that everything is working, again, you can go right click your taskbar and click on Task Manager. And now our graphics card should show up, and it does. So you actually see two GPUs. So you'll see our Radeon graphics. So our CPU does have some built-in graphics. They are not meant for gaming. They are meant for the most basic of basic tasks. Really, they're meant for if your GPU is not working or whatever the reason, you can plug directly in. Or if you have maybe a CPU with slightly more beefy integrated graphics, you might not even have a graphics card. So you should always install the drivers. But we're not really gonna be using these because if you click on this button right here, you'll see our NVIDIA RTX 5080 is showing up. So once you have all of this stuff populating in Task Manager, we're actually in really good shape. Now, there's a lot of things you can do. You should probably install your web browser of choice, grab your Discord, grab your Skype, grab your LimeWire, grab
Nope, shouldn't grab that
grab
anymore.
whatever thing, your uTorrent, whatever you might want to do. We'll censor that one, it's fine. The only other thing I'm gonna show right now, oh, look at that. My MSI driver utility is immediately popped up because it downloaded itself in the background. Sure, it's asking me to install Norton 360, Adobe, and Dropbox. Remember that whole part about how I installed all the drivers that I actually wanted and not all the stuff that they tried to give me? Yeah, this is the point where I tell you that you can say, nope, nope, nope. We'll install MSI Center just so I can adjust my RGB. We're very close to being done. One thing I'm going to do is pop open my settings and we're gonna click on Windows Update. It says I'm up to date. It's a liar. We're gonna need to do this a couple times. So it will probably have, I would say usually at least 2 rounds of updates. So it'll have a bunch of stuff like, yep, see, suddenly it has all kind of stuff. So I'm going to download and install these, let it restart, and then I'm gonna do that same process again. Sometimes even 2 more times. Keep downloading, keep installing, and restart until it is for sure no more updates are available. And this, my friends, is the very happy time where I get to tell you that you have successfully completed your gaming PC build. No, I don't want Lenovo Accessories and Display Manager. Why are you, oh, don't do that. This is the time for you to celebrate. Don't wait too late. No, you can't stop us. Now, if you excuse me, I'm gonna do this tutorial one more time
2026.
Oh God. Surely
We
nothing.
can't stop.
Nothing will change between now and 2026. I'm sure.
This PC will probably cost a whole lot more money next year. Thank you very much for watching this very long and very exhaustive tutorial. Hopefully you enjoyed, hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, make sure to not only subscribe to the channel and ring that ding-a-ling button, but of course you can check out all the components that we use from our wonderful sponsors, Micro Center, at the links in the description. I do want to give a very sincere thank you to Micro Center for making these videos possible every year. We couldn't do it without them, and hopefully you've learned a thing or two about building your next PC, whether it's something crazy high-end or whether it's something that's gonna fit in a shoebox. Don't build your PC in a shoebox. Hopefully you've enjoyed. But isn't it pretty? Look at this. It's like, honestly, this might be one of the most aesthetic builds we've ever done. Like, I'm actually really happy with the way it came out. I'm gonna go sit down. Right. I'm just gonna sit down right here.
There's a chair literally right behind where you were
Not
standing.
as funny.